There is a photograph that has never left the minds of those who saw it. It was taken on a Sunday afternoon in February, in the state of Florida, under a sky so bright it seemed almost indifferent to what was about to happen. The year was 2001. The place was Daytona International Speedway, and in that photograph, a black number 3 Chevrolet Monte Carlo sits crumpled against the outside retaining wall of Turn 4, its front end pushed inward like a fist had struck it from the heavens. The car is still. The dust has not yet settled, and somewhere inside that wreckage, a man who had spent 27 years defying the limits of physics and fate had finally met the one moment he could not outrun. His name was Ralph Dale Earnhardt. The world knew him simply as Dale Earnhardt, but the name that followed him through the decades, the name whispered in grandstands and shouted in victory lanes, the name that became synonymous with a style of racing that no one has been able to replicate, was the Intimidator. That Sunday afternoon, more than 17 million people were watching on television. They had tuned in for the 43rd running of the Daytona 500, the most prestigious race in all of stock car racing. They had come to see a spectacle. What they witnessed instead was a loss so sudden, so absolute, that it changed the sport of auto racing forever. In the final moments of that race, on the final lap, in the final turn, Dale Earnhardt's car made contact with the wall at an estimated speed of 150 miles per hour. The impact was not dramatic in the way Hollywood portrays crashes. There was no fireball. There was no rolling, tumbling wreckage scattered across the track. The car simply slid up the banking, struck the concrete barrier, and came to rest on the grass infield. It looked, to most of the millions watching, like a crash a driver walks away from. But Dale Earnhardt did not walk away. He was 50 years old. He had won 76 Winston Cup races. He had claimed 7 championship titles, tying the all-time record held by the legendary Richard Petty. He had earned the devotion of millions of fans who saw in him something more than a race car driver. They saw a fighter, a man who came from nothing and clawed his way to the top of a sport that tried to break him at every turn. A man whose black car and dark sunglasses became the armor of a warrior, and whose aggressive driving style earned him both reverence and fury in equal measure. And in a single instant, on the last lap of the biggest race of the season, he was gone. The silence that followed was unlike anything the sport had ever experienced. At first, there was confusion. Michael Waltrip, driving a car owned by Earnhardt himself, crossed the finish line in first place. Dale Earnhardt Jr., Earnhardt's son, finished second. It should have been a celebration. It should have been one of the greatest moments in the history of Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, the racing team the elder Earnhardt had built with his own hands. Instead, the celebration never came. Within minutes, word began to spread through the garage area. Something was wrong. The paramedics were taking too long. The helicopter was not lifting off from the infield care center. And then, in a press conference that shook the foundation of American motorsports, Dale Earnhardt had been pronounced dead from injuries sustained in the crash. The Intimidator was gone. In the days that followed, flags flew at half-staff across the American South. Fans placed flowers, hats, and die-cast replicas of the number 3 car at makeshift memorials outside racetracks across the country. Grown men wept openly. Children who had grown up watching Earnhardt race the way their fathers and grandfathers had watched Richard Petty and Junior Johnson felt something break inside them that they could not put into words. The sport of NASCAR, which had been gaining mainstream popularity at an unprecedented rate, was suddenly forced to confront a truth it had been avoiding for decades: that the machines these men drove, at speeds that exceeded 180 miles per hour, were not as safe as anyone had wanted to believe. There is something about the loss of a figure like Dale Earnhardt that transcends the category of sports tragedy. When a man embodies an entire culture, when his name is shorthand for a set of values and a way of life, his absence creates a void that cannot be measured in statistics or championships. The number 3 bumper stickers that appeared on pickup trucks across the Southeast in the weeks after his death were not merchandise. They were statements of identity. They were declarations that something essential had been lost, something that could not be replaced by another driver, another car, or another championship season. The tributes poured in from every corner of the country. From the red clay tracks of Georgia, where Earnhardt had raced as a young man, to the gleaming superspeedways of the modern circuit, people gathered to remember a man who had meant more to them than they could easily articulate. Country music stations played tribute songs around the clock. Churches in small southern towns held memorial services for a man most of their congregations had never met, but felt they knew as well as they knew their own neighbours. The response was not orchestrated. It was organic, spontaneous, and overwhelming in its scope. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why Dale Earnhardt's life mattered so much, and why his death mattered even more. You are going to understand how a high school dropout from a mill town in North Carolina became the most feared and respected driver in the history of stock car racing. You are going to understand the forces that shaped him, the rivalries that defined him, the victories that crowned him, and the single moment that took him away from a sport that could not imagine existing without him. And you are going to understand how the tragedy of his final lap forced an entire industry to change, to evolve, and to ensure that no family, no team, and no community would ever have to endure that kind of loss again. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. This is the story of Dale Earnhardt Sr., the man they called the Intimidator, the driver who lived for the race and died on the track he loved most. Now, let us begin. To understand what happened to Dale Earnhardt on that February afternoon in 2001, you have to understand the machines. You have to understand what a stock car was, what it became, and what it failed to be in the moments that mattered most. Because the story of Dale Earnhardt is not just a story about a man. It is a story about the relationship between a human body and a machine traveling at speeds the human body was never designed to withstand, and the evolution of that machine, from its humble origins to its modern form, is a story of engineering brilliance, corporate ambition, and tragic oversight. In the beginning, stock car racing was exactly what the name implied: stock cars, vehicles that rolled off the assembly line and onto the racetrack, with little more than a number painted on the door and the back seat ripped out to save weight. In the late 1940s, when NASCAR was founded by Bill France Sr. in the coastal city of Daytona Beach, Florida, the cars that competed were the same Ford coupes and Chevrolet sedans that ordinary Americans drove to work and to church. The speeds were modest by modern standards, rarely exceeding 100 miles per hour on the beach road course that served as the sport's first competitive venue. The danger was real, but the scale of it was limited by the capabilities of the machines themselves. A car that could not exceed 95 miles per hour could certainly hurt its driver in a crash, but the forces involved were survivable in most circumstances. The early racers wore leather helmets, if they wore helmets at all. Their protection came from the mass of the car itself and from the relatively low speeds at which they competed. By the 1950s, everything began to change. Manufacturers realized that racing success translated directly into showroom sales, and the arms race of horsepower began in earnest. Engines grew larger, displacement increased. The flathead engines of the 40s gave way to overhead valve designs that produced power figures the early pioneers could not have imagined. A stock Oldsmobile Rocket 88, one of the dominant cars of the early 50s, produced around 135 horsepower. Within a decade, factory-backed racing engines were pushing past 400 horsepower. The Chrysler Hemi, introduced in 1951 as a production engine and rapidly adapted for racing, represented a quantum leap in power output. Its hemispherical combustion chambers allowed for larger valves and more efficient fuel burn, producing numbers that stunned the competition. The cars were faster, but the safety infrastructure had not kept pace. In those early decades, the concept of safety engineering, as it relates to motorsport, was essentially non-existent. The steering columns were solid steel shafts that connected the steering wheel directly to the steering box. In a frontal impact, that shaft became a spear, driven backward into the driver's chest by the force of deceleration. Doors were held closed by stock latches that could pop open on impact, ejecting the driver from the vehicle. Fuel tanks were unprotected steel containers positioned at the rear of the car, vulnerable to rupture in even moderate rear-end collisions. When a fuel tank ruptured and the gasoline found an ignition source, the results were catastrophic. Fire was the great terror of early stock car racing, and the burns suffered by drivers who survived fiery crashes often left scars that lasted a lifetime. The tracks themselves were evolving alongside the machines. Daytona International Speedway opened in 1959, replacing the old beach and road course that had served as NASCAR's spiritual home. Bill France Sr. had envisioned a superspeedway, a massive 2.5-mile oval with high-banked turns that would allow cars to reach speeds previously thought impossible for stock-bodied vehicles. The banking in the turns was 31 degrees, steep enough that a person standing at the bottom and looking up would feel as though the pavement rose above them like a wall. When the first Daytona 500 was held that year, the winning speed exceeded 135 miles per hour, and the world of motorsport was changed forever. Charlotte Motor Speedway, later known as Lowe's Motor Speedway, opened in 1960 and brought superspeedway racing to the heart of the NASCAR country in North Carolina. The track was 1.5 miles in length, with progressive banking that ranged from 24 degrees in the turns to a much flatter 5 degrees on the straights. It was designed to be a different kind of challenge than Daytona, a track that rewarded both raw horsepower and chassis setup, that demanded more from the car and the crew chief than from aerodynamic trickery alone. The World 600, held each May on the weekend closest to Memorial Day, became one of the sport's crown jewel events, a grueling test of endurance that pushed cars and drivers to the limits of their capabilities over 4 hours of racing in the southern heat. Talladega Superspeedway followed in 1969, an even larger track at 2.66 miles with banking of 33 degrees in the turns. The speeds at Talladega were staggering. Cars routinely exceeded 200 miles per hour in testing and qualifying. The combination of high banking, long straightaways, and the aerodynamic properties of the stock car body created a racing environment that pushed the limits of both machine and driver in ways that no one fully understood. The drivers felt the forces. They felt the car wanting to lift off the ground at high speed. They felt the turbulent air behind other cars pushing them sideways. They felt the heat from engines running at maximum output for hours at a time. But they did not have the language or the engineering models to describe what was happening. They simply adapted, the way skilled practitioners always adapt, through instinct and experience and the trial and error process of survival. In 1964, one of NASCAR's most promising young drivers, Joe Weatherly, was fatally injured at Riverside International Raceway in California. His head struck the wall through the open window of his car during a crash. He had been racing without a window net, a simple mesh barrier that would have prevented his head from extending beyond the window opening. His death, along with the fatal injuries suffered by Fireball Roberts that same year from burns sustained in a crash at Charlotte Motor Speedway, prompted some of the sport's first meaningful safety discussions. Roberts had lingered for weeks after his car erupted in flames when it was struck by another vehicle and the fuel cell ruptured. His death was agonizing and public, and it forced the sport to confront the reality that its safety measures were inadequate. But meaningful discussion and meaningful action are not the same thing. The engineering focus throughout the 1960s and 1970s remained almost exclusively on performance. Speed was the currency of the sport, and the teams that could find more of it gained an advantage that translated directly into trophies, sponsorship dollars, and prestige. The aerodynamic wars of the late 1960s produced some of the most iconic and dangerous machines in racing history. The Dodge Charger Daytona and the Plymouth Superbird, with their towering rear wings and elongated nose cones, were designed specifically to cheat the air and push lap speeds beyond 200 miles per hour on the superspeedways. When Buddy Baker tested a Dodge Daytona at Talladega Superspeedway in 1970 and recorded a closed-course speed of 200.447 miles per hour, it was celebrated as a triumph of engineering. The fact that the cars were becoming projectiles and that the human bodies inside them were increasingly vulnerable to the forces generated at such speeds was treated as a secondary concern. The attitude was not callous, at least not intentionally. It was simply the product of a culture that valued speed above safety, competition above caution, and individual toughness above institutional protection. Throughout the 1970s, incremental safety improvements were made. Fuel cells, flexible bladders designed to contain fuel even when the outer container was breached, became mandatory. Roll cages were strengthened. Fire-resistant driving suits became standard equipment. Window nets were required. These were meaningful steps and they saved lives. But they were reactive measures, implemented after specific tragedies had demonstrated specific vulnerabilities. There was no comprehensive safety philosophy guiding the sport's approach to driver protection. There was no systematic effort to anticipate the next threat before it claimed its next victim. Restrictor plates were introduced at the superspeedways in 1988, not primarily as a safety measure in the conventional sense, but in response to Bobby Allison's horrific crash at Talladega, in which his car became airborne and nearly flew into the grandstands. The plates, thin aluminum discs placed between the carburetor and the intake manifold, limited the amount of air entering the engine and reduced horsepower from approximately 750 to around 450. The cars were slower on the straightaways, but the racing changed in ways that introduced new and equally dangerous hazards. The reduced horsepower meant drivers could no longer separate from the pack on speed alone. The cars were so evenly matched in terms of power output that they ran in tight, multi-car drafting packs, traveling within inches of each other at speeds approaching 190 miles per hour. Drafting, the practice of following closely behind another car to take advantage of the reduced air resistance in its wake, had always been a factor at the superspeedways. But the restrictor plate era transformed drafting from a tactical choice into an absolute necessity. A car could not run competitively alone. It needed partners. It needed a draft. And the resulting pack racing meant that a single mistake by one driver, a single loss of control, a single moment of inattention, could trigger a chain reaction involving 10, 15, or even 20 cars. These multi-car crashes, which became known as the Big One, were a regular feature of restrictor plate racing and represented one of the most dangerous aspects of the sport. The aerodynamic sensitivity of the restrictor plate cars created a phenomenon that drivers described as being at the mercy of the air itself. When two cars ran close together at nearly 200 miles per hour, the aerodynamic interaction between them could be unpredictable and violent. A car running in the turbulent wake of the vehicle ahead would lose downforce on the front end, causing the nose to push upward and reducing the effectiveness of the steering. If the following car moved slightly to one side of the lead car, the asymmetric airflow could snap the nose sideways with a force that no human reaction time could correct. The drivers called this phenomenon aero-loose or aero-tight, depending on the direction of the push, and they learned to manage it through experience, instinct, and a deep respect for the invisible forces that swirled around them at speed. But managing it and eliminating it were two very different things, and the restrictor plate tracks remained the venues where the most catastrophic accidents were most likely to occur. The carriage area culture of the 1990s reflected the sport's complicated relationship with danger. Drivers spoke about risk with a studied nonchalance that was part genuine bravery and part cultural performance. Admitting fear was not acceptable. Expressing concern about the safety of the cars or the tracks was seen as a sign of weakness, an invitation for competitors to dismiss you as soft, as someone who did not belong in the cockpit of a race car. The unwritten code held that a real racer accepted the risks without complaint, that danger was the price of admission to the most thrilling sport on earth, and that the men who could not accept that price should find another line of work. This code was not malicious. It was not enforced through deliberate cruelty. It was simply the air that everyone in the garage area breathed, as invisible and as pervasive as if the exhaust fumes that hung over the pit lane after a long practice session. The medical understanding of what happened to the human body during a high-speed crash advanced considerably during this era, but that understanding was concentrated in the academic and research communities rather than in the racing community itself. Biomechanical engineers at universities and research laboratories were studying the effects of rapid deceleration on the human body with increasingly sophisticated tools and methods. They were measuring the forces that caused traumatic brain injury, spinal cord damage, and internal organ disruption. They were developing computer models that could simulate the behavior of the human body during an impact event. And they were publishing their findings in journals that no one in the NASCAR garage area ever read. The roll cage evolved steadily throughout these decades. By the 1990s, the cage was a sophisticated structure of chromoly steel tubing, welded into a configuration that surrounded the driver on all sides. The roof bars, door bars, and floor members were designed to maintain the integrity of the driver's compartment, even in the most violent rollovers. And they did, for the most part, succeed in that goal. Drivers survived crashes that would have been unsurvivable in earlier decades, and the roll cage was rightly credited as one of the most important safety innovations in the sport's history. The evolution of pit road safety represented another dimension of the sport's uneven relationship with danger. In the early decades, pit stops were conducted with almost no safety equipment or protocol. Crew members worked in street clothes, standing inches from cars traveling at unsafe speeds as they refueled and changed tires. The fuel itself was poured from cans that offered minimal protection against spills. Jack failures could drop a 3,000-pound car onto a mechanic's hand or arm. There were no speed limits on pit road until the late 1980s, which meant that cars entering the pit lane were decelerating from racing speed while weaving between crew members and equipment. Pit road accidents, including fires that engulfed crew members who had been doused with gasoline during a fueling mishap, were disturbingly common throughout the 70s and 80s. The introduction of pit road speed limits, the development of improved fueling equipment with dry brake couplings that reduced spillage, and the requirement for fire-resistant uniforms for crew members were all steps that reduced the hazard. But like so many safety improvements in NASCAR, they came after a series of incidents that demonstrated the consequences of their absence. The pattern was consistent. Someone got hurt, the sport studied the problem, a rule was implemented, and then everyone waited for the next incident to reveal the next vulnerability that the existing rules had not anticipated. Track surface technology advanced considerably from the rough, crumbling asphalt of the early superspeedways to the precisely engineered pavement of the modern era. Tracks experimented with different asphalt compounds, varying the coarseness of the aggregate to balance grip against tire wear. Some venues, like Bristol Motor Speedway, experimented with concrete surfaces that offered greater durability but different grip characteristics. The interaction between the track surface and the tire compound was a critical variable in both performance and safety, as a sudden loss of grip could send a car spinning into the wall with devastating consequences. The communication systems inside the cars evolved from non-existent to sophisticated two-way radio networks that allowed drivers, crew chiefs, and spotters to exchange information in real time. The spotter, a team member positioned high above the track, with a clear view of the entire racing surface, became the driver's eyes and ears, warning him of crashes ahead, informing him of cars approaching from behind, and helping him navigate through traffic. The addition of the spotter's role was itself a safety improvement, born from the recognition that a driver traveling at nearly 200 miles per hour in the middle of a drafting pack could not possibly see everything he needed to see from the cockpit of a stock car. The spotter became the driver's guardian angel, a voice in his ear that could mean the difference between avoiding a wreck and being swept into one. And the evolution of spotter communications, from basic hand signals to sophisticated radio networks, represented yet another dimension of the sport's gradual, uneven march toward better driver protection. The tires, too, had undergone a revolution. Goodyear, the sole tire supplier for NASCAR since the late 1950s, had developed tires specifically engineered for the demands of stock car racing. The compounds were designed to provide maximum grip while withstanding the tremendous heat generated by running at sustained high speeds on abrasive track surfaces. The inner liner, A separate tire mounted inside the outer tire was introduced as a safety measure to prevent sudden deflation. If the outer tire lost air pressure, the inner liner could support the car long enough for the driver to slow down safely. It was a simple innovation that prevented countless accidents over the decades, and it was born from the painful experience of watching drivers lose control when a tire failed without warning at high speed. The engines themselves were marvels of the racing engineer's art. A NASCAR Winston Cup engine of the late 1990s was a purpose-built racing power plant that bore little mechanical resemblance to its production counterpart, despite sharing the same basic architecture. The block was cast iron, the cylinder heads were aluminum, and the internal components, the crankshaft, the connecting rods, the pistons, the camshaft, were manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. These engines produced enormous power, but they did so within the constraints of NASCAR's rules, which mandated carburation rather than fuel injection, pushrod valve actuation rather than overhead cams, and naturally aspirated operation rather than turbocharging or supercharging. The engineering challenge was not simply to produce horsepower, it was to produce the maximum possible horsepower within a tightly regulated framework, to find every fractional advantage that the rules permitted, and to do so with sufficient reliability to survive 500 miles of racing. The fuel system had been progressively improved over the decades. The rubber fuel cell, designed to contain fuel even when the surrounding structure was damaged, had become standard equipment in the 1960s. The cell was fitted with foam baffles that prevented the fuel from sloshing and reduced the risk of explosion in a crash. The fuel lines were reinforced, the connections were self-sealing. The entire fuel system was designed to keep the gasoline where it belonged, inside the cell and flowing through the engine, rather than spreading across the racetrack or onto a hot exhaust system. All of these improvements, the roll cage, the tires, the fuel cell, the fire-resistant suits, the window nets, the improved helmets, represented genuine progress in driver safety. They were the product of decades of hard-won experience, each innovation born from a specific incident or a specific loss that forced the sport to confront a specific vulnerability. But they shared a common limitation. They were all designed to protect against threats that had already manifested, injuries and deaths that had already occurred. They were reactive. They addressed the last war, not the next one. And the next war, the threat that was quietly building through the 1990s as speeds climbed and impacts became more severe, was the vulnerability of the human head and neck to the forces generated by sudden deceleration. The roll cage could protect the body, the harness could hold the torso in place, the fire suit could resist the flames, but nothing in the standard equipment package addressed the fundamental problem of an unrestrained head snapping forward during a frontal impact with a rigid barrier. But the roll cage protected against one type of threat while leaving another almost entirely unaddressed. It protected against intrusion, against the crushing forces that could collapse the driver's compartment from the outside. What it did not protect against were the deceleration forces experienced by the driver's body during a sudden stop. When a car struck a solid barrier at high speed, the cage could keep its shape while the driver's body, and particularly the driver's head and neck, experienced forces that exceeded the limits of human physiology. This phenomenon, known as basilar skull fracture, had been quietly claiming the lives of race car drivers for years before Earnhardt's death. The mechanisms was well understood in medical and biomechanical engineering communities. When a body is restrained by a harness, but the head is free to move, a sudden deceleration causes the head to snap forward with tremendous force. The base of the skull, where it connects to the spinal column, is the weakest point in this chain. Under sufficient force, the skull separates from the spine at this junction. The injury is almost always immediately fatal. In the years leading up to Dale Earnhardt's death, at least 3 other NASCAR drivers had died from this exact injury. Adam Petty, the grandson of Richard Petty, and the 4th generation of the most famous family in stock car racing, was fatally injured in a practice crash at New Hampshire Motor Speedway in May of 2000. His throttle stuck open, sending his car into the Turn 3 wall at high speed. The impact was relatively straightforward, a frontal collision with a concrete barrier. The car was not heavily damaged, but Adam Petty died from basilar skull fracture. He was 19 years old. Kenny Irwin Jr. died at the same track just 2 months later in an eerily similar crash. His throttle also stuck, propelling his car into the wall in the same turn. He was 30 years old. Tony Roper, a Truck Series driver, was fatally injured at Texas Motor Speedway in October of 2000 in a crash that also resulted in basilar skull fracture. He was 35 years old. 3 deaths, same injury, same mechanism, same preventable cause. The device that could have saved all of them already existed. It was called the HANDS device, an acronym for head and neck support. It had been developed in the early 1980s by Dr. Robert Hubbard, a biomechanical engineer at Michigan State University, in collaboration with his brother-in-law Jim Downing, a sports car racer who had witnessed too many friends suffer head and neck injuries on the track. The HANDS device was a simple but elegant solution. A collar worn around the shoulders, connected to the helmet by flexible tethers, that prevented the head from snapping forward in a crash while still allowing normal head movement during driving. The device worked by redirecting the forces acting on the head during deceleration through the shoulder yoke and into the seat harness, rather than allowing those forces to concentrate at the base of the skull. By the mid-1990s, the device had been thoroughly tested, validated by independent research conducted at multiple universities and crash testing facilities, and was commercially available for purchase by any racing team or individual driver who wanted one. The cost was modest relative to the overall expense of competing in professional motorsport, roughly $1,000 for the device itself, plus the cost of compatible helmet anchors. It was not a prohibitively expensive technology. It was not an experimental prototype awaiting further development. It was a proven, affordable, commercially available piece of safety equipment that addressed a known, documented, and frequently fatal vulnerability. Other racing series around the world had begun to take notice. Formula One, which had undergone its own safety reckoning after the death of Ayrton Senna at Imola in 1994, was exploring head and neck restraint requirements. The FIA, Motorsport's international governing body, had invested heavily in crash testing, barrier development, and cockpit protection in the years following Senna's death, and the HANDS device was part of that broader safety conversation. The Indy Racing League had begun encouraging its use. CART, the rival open-wheel series, was moving in the similar direction. Sports car racing organizations in Europe and North America were adopting the device with increasing frequency. But in NASCAR, adoption was voluntary. The sanctioning body did not require it. Many drivers, including Dale Earnhardt, refused to wear one. Earnhardt's reasons were emblematic of the broader culture. He found the device uncomfortable. He believed it restricted his ability to see out of the car during close racing on the superspeedways, where the ability to look left and right was critical for survival in the drafting packs. He wore an open-face helmet rather than a full-face model, preferring the wider field of vision despite the reduced facial protection. He ran his seatbelts with more slack than recommended, believing that the ability to move his upper body during racing outweighed the incremental safety benefit of tighter restraints. These were not decisions born of ignorance. They were decisions born of a culture that prized individual judgment and personal toughness above institutional mandates, a culture in which the willingness to accept risk was seen as a fundamental quality of a race car driver. The cars of the 2001 era were, in many respects, engineering marvels. The Winston Cup Series Chevrolet Monte Carlo that Earnhardt drove weighed approximately 3,400 pounds with the driver aboard. It was powered by a pushrod V8 engine displacing 358 cubic inches, producing in the neighborhood of 450 horsepower at the restrictor plate tracks and closer to 750 horsepower at unrestricted venues. The chassis was a purpose-built tube frame made of steel tubing, welded into a cage that surrounded the driver on all sides. The body panels were hand-shaped sheet metal, designed to slip through the air as efficiently as possible. The suspension was a relatively simple setup of double wishbones in the front and a solid rear axle located by trailing arms and a track bar. These cars were built to go fast, They were built to withstand the lateral forces of high-banked corners taken at nearly 200 miles per hour. They were built to absorb the punishment of 3-hour races on abrasive asphalt surfaces. But they were not built to absorb the energy of a high-speed impact into a rigid concrete wall. The front end of the car was designed for aerodynamic efficiency, not crash absorption. There were no crumple zones engineered into the structure. No energy-absorbing barriers stood between the car and the concrete. The wall itself was a slab of reinforced concrete, as unyielding as bedrock. When car met wall, all of the kinetic energy of the impact was transferred through the chassis, through the seat, through the harness, and into the driver's body in a single, devastating pulse measured in milliseconds. The engineering community had the knowledge. The devices existed. The data was clear. What was lacking was the institutional will to mandate change in a sport where freedom and personal choice were deeply embedded in its identity. Dale Earnhardt was not simply a victim of a crash. He was a victim of a cultural moment in which the technology to save him existed, but the framework to require its use did not. And that is what makes the story of his death not just a tragedy of motorsport, but a tragedy of engineering delayed, of safety deferred, and of lessons that arrived too late for the one man who needed them most. The machines had outpaced the protections, the speeds had exceeded the safeguards, and the gap between what was possible and what was mandated had grown wide enough to swallow a legend whole. This was the world in which Dale Earnhardt raced. This was the machine he trusted with his life. And this was the failure that, when the final moment came, the machine could not prevent. To understand the full weight of what was lost that day, you have to go back further. You have to go to the beginning. You have to go to a small town in North Carolina, where a boy grew up in the shadow of a father who raced, and where the roar of engines was the first music he ever learned to love. Ralph Dale Earnhardt was born on April 29, 1951, in the town of Kannapolis, North Carolina. Kannapolis was a mill town, built around the Cannon Mills textile operations that employed most of the town's residents and defined its rhythms, its economy, and its identity. The houses were small, most of them company-owned, lined up along narrow streets in the shadow of the factory that provided nearly everything the community had. The work inside those mills was hard, physical, and relentless. Shifts ran around the clock. The air was thick with cotton dust. The pay was modest. And the families who lived there understood, without anyone needing to explain it, that the world did not owe them anything. If you wanted something in Kannapolis, you worked for it with your hands. If you failed, you got up and worked harder. This was not philosophy. It was survival. It was the only life most people in that town had ever known, and it shaped the character of everyone who grew up within its boundaries. Dale's father was Ralph Earnhardt, a man whose name may not carry the same weight as Petty or Yarborough or Pearson in the broader public consciousness, but who was, among those who knew racing in the Carolinas, a figure of enormous respect and considerable legend. Ralph Earnhardt was a short-track racer, a man who made his living competing on the small, dirt and paved ovals that dotted the landscape of the American Southeast like freckles on sunburned skin. These were not glamorous venues. They were half-mile and quarter-mile bull rings carved out of red clay, surrounded by wooden guardrails and lit by towers of incandescent bulbs that cast harsh shadows across the racing's surface. The purses were small, the competition was fierce, and the men who raced there did so because they loved the act of racing itself, because the feeling of a car sliding through a dirt corner at the limits of adhesion was worth more to them than the modest check they might collect at the end of the night. Ralph Earnhardt won the NASCAR Sportsman Division Championship in 1956, a title that in those days carried significant prestige in the regional racing community, even if it did not command national headlines. He was known for his mechanical skill as much as his driving ability. He built his own engines in a small garage behind the family home, a cinder block structure where the smell of motor oil and solvent hung permanently in the air. He fabricated his own parts when factory components were too expensive or simply unavailable. He could take an engine apart, diagnose its weaknesses, repair them, and reassemble it in a fraction of the time it took other racers to accomplish the same task. His cars were not the fastest on the track, at least not always, but they were prepared with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, and they rarely broke. It was in that garage, amid the scattered wrenches and the grease-stained workbench and the bare light bulb that swung from the ceiling on a cord, that young Dale received his first education in the art and science of racing. He was not a passive student. From the time he could hold a wrench, he was under the car, watching his father work, handing him tools, absorbing the methodology and the mentality that would shape his own approach to the sport. Ralph did not coddle his son. He did not offer praise freely. He taught by example and expected comprehension. When he told Dale to do something, he expected it done correctly the first time. When Dale made a mistake, Ralph corrected it with a bluntness that left no room for misinterpretation. The message was clear and consistent. Do it right, or do not bother doing it at all. The relationship between father and son was complex, shaped by the era, the culture, and the temperaments of both men. Ralph Earnhardt was not a man who expressed affection through words or gestures of warmth. He expressed it through inclusion, through the act of allowing his son into the garage, onto the racetrack, into the world that defined his own identity. Dale would later describe his father as the hardest man he ever knew, a man who could look at an engine and hear what was wrong with it before a single diagnostic test was run, who could feel the track surface through the steering wheel and adjust his driving line with an instinct that seemed to operate below the level of conscious thought. Dale was not a natural student in the traditional academic sense. School held little interest for him. The classroom felt confining, the lessons abstract and disconnected from the tactile, immediate world he inhabited in his father's garage and at the local racetracks. He was not unintelligent. Those who knew him well throughout his life described a sharp mind, a quick wit, and an ability to process complex information about cars and racing strategy that was nothing short of extraordinary. But the formal education system of the 1960s in small-town North Carolina was not designed to nurture a mind like his, a mind that learned through doing rather than reading, through feeling rather than reciting. By the time he reached the 9th grade, the pull of the racetrack had become irresistible. He dropped out of school at the age of 16, a decision that was not unusual in Kannapolis at the time, where many young men left school to take jobs in the mills or in the trades. But it was a decision that carried consequences he would feel for the rest of his life. Without a diploma, his options in the conventional workforce were limited. The doors that education might have opened remained closed. But Dale did not want a conventional life. He did not want to stand on the floor of a textile mill for 30 years and retire with a modest pension and a bad back. He wanted to race. He wanted to do the one thing that made him feel fully alive, the one thing that connected him to his father and to a tradition that ran deeper in him than any academic credential ever could. His early years in racing were marked by struggle, not the romantic, cinematic kind of struggle that makes for inspiring montages and motivational speeches. Real struggle, the kind that involves borrowed money that cannot be repaid, unpaid bills stacking up on the kitchen table, meals skipped so that parts could be purchased for a car that might not finish the race it was entered in. Dale married young to a woman named Latane Brown, and they had a son named Kerry. The marriage did not last. He married again to Brenda G, and they had 2 children, Kelly and Dale Jr. That marriage also ended. The pattern was not unusual among young men in the racing community, men who spent their nights at the track and their days under the car, men whose passion for racing consumed the energy and attention that marriages require to survive. During these years, Earnhardt worked whatever jobs he could find to fund his racing. He installed insulation, crawling into attics and crawl spaces in the North Carolina heat. He worked at a wheel alignment shop. He welded. He hustled. He did whatever was necessary to scrape together the money to keep his car running and his name on entry lists at tracks across the Carolinas. The money was always short. The equipment was always second-hand. The odds were always against him, but he kept showing up. He kept racing. He kept believing, with a stubbornness that defied rational calculation, that his talent would eventually be recognized and rewarded. The dirt tracks of the Carolinas in the early and mid-1970s were a brutal proving ground for aspiring stock car drivers. The competition was fierce, populated by men who had been racing for years and who knew every bump, every rut, every line on every track within a 100-mile radius of their homes. The payouts were meagre. A Saturday night feature race at a quarter-mile bullring might pay $200 to the winner, and nothing at all to the cars that finished outside the top 5. The economics of short-track racing were punishing. The cost of tyres alone could exceed the winner's purse. A blown engine meant weeks of lost income and additional expense. A crash could destroy not just the car, but the entire financial foundation of a young racer's operation, such as it was. Earnhardt raced at tracks with names that resonated through the local racing community, but meant nothing to the national audience that would later worship him. Concord Speedway, Metrolina Speedway, Hickory Motor Speedway, Caraway Speedway. These were modest facilities, most of them a quarter-mile or a third of a mile in length, with wooden guardrails and packed clay surfaces that turned to dust in the heat and to mud in the rain. The grandstands held a few thousand spectators at most. The concession stands sold hot dogs and sodas and little else. The atmosphere was raw, intimate, and intensely competitive, a world away from the corporate spectacle that NASCAR would become in the following decades. On these tracks, Earnhardt developed the driving style that would later terrify the Winston Cup field. He learned to use the slide. On dirt, a car does not grip the surface the way it does on pavement. The rear end is constantly trying to come around, constantly threatening to swap ends and send the car spinning into the infield, or worse, into the wall. The key to fast lap times on dirt is not to fight the slide, but to embrace it, to steer the car with the throttle as much as with the steering wheel, to maintain a controlled drift through the corners that keeps the car pointed in roughly the right direction while allowing it to cover ground at the maximum possible speed. Earnhardt mastered this technique so thoroughly that when he transitioned to pavement racing at the national level, he brought the same philosophy with him. Where other drivers sought the clean, smooth, geometrically precise racing line, Earnhardt attacked the corners with a dirt track mentality that produced a car that appeared on the verge of losing control at all times. It was a style that was thrilling to watch, difficult to compete against, and nearly impossible to teach. The sacrifices during these years extended beyond the financial. Earnhardt's family life suffered under the strain of his single-minded pursuit of a racing career. The hours spent in the garage, at the racetrack, and on the road meant hours not spent with his children, not spent building the domestic foundations that marriages require. The pattern of failed relationships during this period was not unique to Earnhardt. Many young racers of his generation followed the same trajectory, their personal lives subordinated to the all-consuming demands of a profession that left little room for anything else. But the cost was real, and it was paid by people who had not chosen the racing life for themselves, by wives who waited and children who grew up with an absent father. And the truth gets heavier when you realize that during these years of grinding poverty and relentless determination, Dale Earnhardt was not simply chasing a dream in the abstract. He was trying to become his father. He was trying to prove that the lessons learned in that garage, the skills passed down through grease-stained hands and terse instructions, had not been wasted. He was trying to honor a legacy that he had never been told, in so many words, that he was expected to carry. But he felt the weight of it nonetheless. Every time he climbed into a race car, he was driving for Ralph. Every win, every loss, every crash was measured against the standard his father had set. Ralph Earnhardt died suddenly on September 26, 1973. He suffered a heart attack while working on a car in his garage, the place where he had spent most of his waking hours. The place where he had taught his son everything he knew became the place where he drew his last breath. He was 45 years old. Dale was 22. The loss was devastating in ways that went beyond the natural grief of losing a parent. Dale had lost his teacher. He had lost his measuring stick. He had lost the one person whose approval he sought above all others. And he had lost him before he had the chance to show him what he could do at the highest level of the sport. Ralph Earnhardt never saw his son race in the Winston Cup Series. He never saw the championships, the victories, the fame, the transformation of the Earnhardt name from a regional racing curiosity into a national phenomenon. He died in the same garage where he had taught Dale to turn a wrench, surrounded by the tools and the engines, and the remnants of a life spent in service to the art of making a car go fast. And the echo of that loss, the unresolved conversation between a father who demanded excellence and a son who spent his entire career trying to deliver it, reverberated through everything Dale Earnhardt did for the next 27 years. Dale's first attempt at the Winston Cup level came in 1975, when he competed in the World 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway, driving for a small, underfunded team. He finished 22nd. It was not a result that made headlines or turned heads in the garage area, but it was a beginning. It was proof that the Milltown kid could at least compete at the highest level without embarrassing himself. Over the next 3 years, he ran a handful of additional races for various teams, showing flashes of the aggressive, fearless driving style that would later become his trademark, but never finding the consistent funding, sponsorship, or equipment needed to compete at the front of the field. He drove for a team owned by Will Cronkite. He drove for a team fielded by Ed Negre. He drove for anyone who would give him a seat and an engine, and he made the most of every opportunity, however modest. His results were mixed, but his reputation grew. Word spread through the garage area that the Earnhardt kid had something, that he could drive, that he was rough around the edges, but had a feel for the car that reminded people of his father. And in a sport where reputation often precedes opportunity, that word of mouth was the currency that eventually bought him the chance he needed. The reputation was built on performances that local racing observers still talk about decades later. At Concord Speedway, Earnhardt won feature races against fields filled with seasoned veterans who had twice his experience. At Metrolina, he battled wheel to wheel with the best short-track racers in the Southeast and more than held his own. He was not winning every race. He was not dominating the way he would later dominate the Winston Cup Series. But he was showing flashes of something extraordinary, moments of car control and competitive instinct that marked him as a driver of rare and potentially transcendent ability. The old hands in the garage areas of those small Carolina tracks recognized what they were seeing. They had seen it before in his father, and they knew that if the kid ever got the right equipment beneath him, the results would be spectacular. The breakthrough came in 1979, when car owner Rod Osterland gave Earnhardt a full-time ride in the Winston Cup Series. Osterland was a California businessman who had entered NASCAR team ownership with serious resources and serious ambitions, and his decision to hire the young, unproven Earnhardt was a gamble that paid dividends beyond anyone's expectations. In his first full season, driving the number 2 Chevrolet sponsored by Wrangler Jeans, Earnhardt won 1 race at Bristol Motor Speedway, posted 11 top 5 finishes, and earned the Winston Cup Rookie of the Year award. His driving style was immediately noticeable. Where other drivers finessed the car around the track, finding the smoothest, most efficient line through each corner, Earnhardt muscled it. He entered corners harder than physics seemed to permit, overdriving the front end, and then catching the slide with a burst of throttle that transferred weight to the rear tires and pulled the car through the turn in a controlled drift. He used the bumper as a tool, not as a weapon, at least not yet, but as a means of communication. A tap on the rear bumper of the car ahead of him was a message. Move over. I am here, and I am coming through. He was not the smoothest driver in the field. He was not the most technically precise. Veteran observers noted that his car control was sometimes ragged, that he took risks that more experienced drivers would have avoided, that his aggression occasionally crossed the line from bold to reckless. But he was, without question, the most exciting driver to watch, and in the world of stock car racing, where entertainment and competition are inseparable, that quality was worth its weight in sponsorship gold. In 1980, just his second full season in the Winston Cup Series, Dale Earnhardt won the championship. He was 29 years old. He won 5 races, posted 19 top 10 finishes, and accumulated enough points to clinch the title in a season that saw him battling established veterans like Cale Yarborough and Darrell Waltrip. It was the fastest rise to a championship in the modern era of the sport at that time, and it announced to the racing world that a new force had arrived. The Milltown kid who had dropped out of school, who had scraped together pennies to race on dirt tracks, who had worked manual labor jobs to keep his racing dream alive, was now the champion of the most competitive stock car racing series in the world. It was a narrative that resonated deeply with NASCAR's fan base, many of whom came from similar backgrounds and saw in Earnhardt's rise a validation of their own values and aspirations. If Dale Earnhardt could make it, starting from where he started, with nothing but talent and determination, then maybe the system was not entirely rigged against the working man after all. But success at this level is fragile, and the years that followed the first championship were turbulent. A change in team ownership led Earnhardt to leave the Osterland operation after the first few races of the 1981 season. He spent the remainder of that year and the 1982 season driving for the legendary Bud Moore, a former World War II veteran and longtime car owner who was among the most respected figures in the sport. Earnhardt won races with Moore, including victories at Darlington and Nashville, but the team lacked the resources and the consistency to contend for the championship. It was a period of professional frustration, a reminder that talent alone is not enough in stock car racing. The driver is only as good as the car beneath him, and the car is only as good as the team, the funding, and the engineering behind it. The partnership that changed everything came in 1984, when Earnhardt joined Richard Childress Racing. Richard Childress was a former driver from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, who had transitioned into car ownership after a driving career that was competent but unremarkable. What Childress lacked in driving talent he made up for in organizational ability, business acumen, and an intuitive understanding of what a championship racing team required. He was quiet where Earnhardt was loud. He was methodical where Earnhardt was instinctive. He was diplomatic where Earnhardt was confrontational. The contrast in temperaments was striking, and it was precisely this contrast that made the partnership work. Childress understood that Earnhardt needed a team that could keep pace with his ambition. He invested in equipment, in personnel, in the infrastructure needed to build cars that could compete with the best in the sport. He hired Kirk Shelmerdine as crew chief, a pairing that would prove to be one of the most successful in NASCAR history. Shelmerdine was a brilliant mechanic and strategist who shared Earnhardt's competitive fire and understood, at a deep level, how to build a car that suited Earnhardt's unique driving style. Together, the three of them, Childress, Earnhardt, and Shelmerdine, formed the foundation of what would become one of the most dominant teams the sport had ever seen. The results were not immediate. The 1984 season produced 2 victories but no championship. The 1985 season was similar, with 4 wins but a 4th-place finish in the final standings. The team was good, but it was not yet great. The pieces were in place, but the chemistry had not fully ignited. That ignition came in 1986. Earnhardt won 5 races that year, led the points standings for most of the season, and claimed his second Winston Cup championship. The performance was dominant, but it was the manner of the dominance that caught the attention of the sporting world. Earnhardt did not just beat his competitors, he demoralized them. He drove with a controlled fury that was unlike anything the sport had seen since the days of Curtis Turner and Joe Weatherly in the early 1960s. He would start at the back of the field after a poor qualifying effort and carve his way to the front within 20 laps, passing cars with a combination of skill and intimidation that left his rivals shaking their heads in grudging admiration. The relationship with Richard Childress deepened during this period, evolving from a professional partnership into something more personal and profound. The two men spent time together away from the racetrack, hunting and fishing on Childress's property in North Carolina. They developed a shorthand communication style, a way of discussing the car and the race strategy that required few words but conveyed enormous amounts of information. Earnhardt would come in from a practice session, sit down next to Childress, and in a few terse sentences describe exactly what the car was doing, what it needed, and what changes would fix it. Childress would nod, relay the information to the crew, and the changes would be made. The process was efficient, direct, and remarkably effective. It was a partnership built on mutual trust, on the understanding that each man excelled in his particular role, and that the best results came when neither tried to do the other's job. Crew Chief Kirk Shelmerdine was the third essential element of this triumvirate. Shelmerdine was a gifted mechanic and a creative thinker who understood the aerodynamic and chassis dynamics of stock car racing at an intuitive level. He built cars that suited Earnhardt's driving style, cars that were slightly loose, meaning that the rear end was prone to stepping out in the corners, requiring the driver to make constant corrections. Most drivers hated a loose car. It was unstable, it was unpredictable, it punished mistakes harshly and rewarded only the most sensitive and responsive drivers. Earnhardt thrived in a loose car. He used the instability as a weapon, allowing the rear end to slide and then catching it with throttle and steering inputs that happened so quickly they appeared reflexive. The car looked out of control to observers. It was, in fact, under the most precise control imaginable. The control of a man who understood the machine beneath him the way a horseman understands his mount. The working relationship between Earnhardt and Shelmerdine extended beyond race weekends into the long hours spent in the shop during the week. Earnhardt was not a hands-off driver who showed up on Saturday and expected the car to be ready. He was involved in the process, visiting the shop, walking around the car, offering suggestions that were rooted in his extraordinary feel for how a machine behaved at speed. Shelmerdine learned to translate Earnhardt's sometimes cryptic descriptions of what the car was doing into specific mechanical adjustments. When Earnhardt said the car was tight getting into the corner but free in the middle, Shelmerdine knew exactly which springs to change, which track bar adjustment to make, which sway bar to disconnect. The two men developed a technical vocabulary that was uniquely their own, a language of chassis dynamics spoken in the idiom of dirt track racers from the Carolina foothills. The 6 championship seasons under Shelmerdine's guidance, from 1986 through 1994, represented the peak of the Childress-Earnhardt-Shelmerdine partnership. During this stretch, Earnhardt won 6 of his 7 career championships, an achievement that placed him in the most elite company in the sport's history. The consistency of the team's performance was remarkable. Year after year, the number 3 car was a contender. Year after year, the combination of Earnhardt's driving talent, Childress's organizational excellence, and Shelmerdine's mechanical genius produced results that left the competition grasping for answers. The financial rewards of this success were enormous by the standards of the era. Earnhardt's earnings from purse money, appearance fees, and merchandise sales made him one of the wealthiest athletes in America. The Earnhardt brand, anchored by the iconic number 3 and the Goodwrench sponsorship, generated tens of millions of dollars annually in licensed merchandise alone. Die-cast replicas of his race car were among the best-selling items in the history of sports merchandising. His image adorned everything from t-shirts to coffee mugs to the hoods of full-sized pickup trucks. The Milltown kid who had once scraped together pennies to buy racing tires was now a millionaire many times over, a transformation that would have been unimaginable to the young man who had dropped out of school at 16 and worked odd jobs to fund his racing habit. But financial success did not change the essential character of the man. Those who knew Earnhardt well, who spent time with him away from the cameras and the crowds, described a person who remained grounded in the values of his upbringing. He was generous with his money, often quietly and without seeking recognition. He paid medical bills for injured drivers and crew members who lacked insurance. He bought equipment for struggling teams that reminded him of his own early years. He donated to charities that served the communities where racing was rooted, the small towns and rural counties of the American South, where the sport had its origins. He did not discuss these acts of generosity publicly. He would have considered it unseemly, a violation of the code that said you helped people because it was right, not because it made you look good. His personal life during these years was anchored by his marriage to Teresa Houston, whom he married in 1982. Teresa was the daughter of Hal Houston, a race car fabricator and short-track competitor, and the niece of Tommy Houston, a well-known Busch Series driver. She understood the racing life in a way that Earnhardt's previous wives had not, and the marriage proved to be the stable foundation that his personal life had previously lacked. Together they had a daughter, Taylor Nicole, born in 1988. The family settled on a large farm property outside Mooresville, North Carolina, where Earnhardt could indulge his love of the outdoors, hunting deer and turkey on his own land, fishing in the ponds he had stocked himself, and raising cattle with the same hands that controlled a race car at 200 miles per hour. The farm was Earnhardt's sanctuary. It was the place where the persona of the Intimidator fell away and the private man emerged. He was a devoted, if sometimes awkward, father to his children from multiple marriages. His relationship with Kerry, his eldest son, had been strained by the divorce from Kerry's mother and by the long absences that a racing career demanded. His relationships with Kelly and Dale Jr. were complicated by the same pressures, by the difficulty of being present as a father when your profession required you to spend weekends in a different city nearly every week of the year, surrounded by the demands of sponsors, media, and competition. But those who witnessed the private moments, the fishing trips, the hunting expeditions, the quiet dinners at the farm, described a man who loved his children fiercely and who struggled, in the way that many men of his generation and his background struggled, to express that love in words rather than actions. He followed the second championship with a third in 1987, a year in which he won 11 of 29 races and dominated the series with a level of superiority that bordered on the absurd. 11 wins in 29 starts. That is a winning percentage of nearly 38%, a number that would be considered exceptional in any era of the sport. He led more laps than any other driver. He finished in the top 5 21 times. The black number 3 Chevrolet, now adorned with the Goodwrench sponsorship that would become as iconic as the car itself, was the most feared machine in the garage area. The persona of the Intimidator crystallized during these championship years. Earnhardt drove with a calculated aggression that was part instinct, part strategy, and part theatre. He understood the psychological dimension of racing in a way that few of his contemporaries did. He knew that if he could get inside the head of the driver ahead of him, if he could make that driver worry about what the black number 3 was going to do, he had already won half the battle. The intimidation was not random or unfocused. It was deliberate, it was targeted, and it was devastatingly effective. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses even on cloudy days, became the most famous eyes in racing. Competitors described the experience of looking in their rear-view mirrors and seeing the black number 3 filling the frame as something approaching dread, not because they thought Earnhardt would wreck them, not because they believed he was dangerous, but because they knew with absolute certainty that the man behind the wheel of that car would do whatever it took to get past them, and that their only options were to race him harder than they had ever raced anyone, or to get out of his way. But the aggression was not mindless. Earnhardt possessed an extraordinary feel for the car, an ability to sense the limits of traction, balance, and control that bordered on the mystical. Veteran crew chiefs who worked with him described a driver who could tell them, after a single lap, that the left rear tyre was 2 pounds low on air pressure. He could feel the track temperature change through the seat of his pants and adjust his driving line accordingly. He could read the draft of another car from 50 car lengths back and position himself to make a pass that seemed impossible to anyone watching from a distance. This was not luck. This was not bravado. This was the product of a lifetime of seat time, starting on the dirt tracks of the Carolinas and refined through thousands of laps at every track on the circuit. The championships kept coming. A 4th title in 1990, a 5th in 1991, a 6th in 1993, a 7th in 1994, tying the all-time record held by Richard Petty. 7 championships, a number that carried symbolic weight in a sport that revered tradition and legacy. Richard Petty, the king, had set the standard. Dale Earnhardt, the Intimidator, had matched it. The two men, from different eras and with vastly different public personas, were forever linked in the record books, their names occupying the same line in the sport's history. And yet, for all his success, there was one race that eluded him for most of his career, one race that haunted him, one race that seemed to take perverse pleasure in denying him the victory he wanted most: the Daytona 500. Earnhardt's relationship with the Daytona 500 was one of the most compelling and agonizing narratives in the history of American sports. He was, without question, the best restrictor plate racer of his generation, perhaps the best of any generation. He won the Daytona qualifying races, known as the Twin 125s, multiple times. He dominated the Pepsi 400, the July race at Daytona, repeatedly. He could read the draft better than anyone in the field, position his car with uncanny precision, and make moves that other drivers did not see coming until it was too late. But the 500 itself, the great American race, the crown jewel of the NASCAR schedule, refused to surrender to him year after agonizing year. In 1990, he was leading with less than a mile to go when he ran over a piece of debris, a bell housing bolt that had fallen from another car, that cut a rear tire. The tire went flat entering the final turn, and the car slid up the track, allowing Derrike Cope, a driver with no prior Cup wins, to slip past and steal one of the most improbable victories in Daytona 500 history. In 1993, he dueled with Dale Jarrett in the closing laps and came up short. In 1995, a late race pit stop decision cost him the lead. In 1996, another heartbreak. Year after year, the story repeated itself. The Daytona 500 became Dale Earnhardt's white whale, the one prize that his talent, his aggression, and his iron will could not seem to capture. And then, in 1998, it finally happened. After 20 years of trying, after 19 previous attempts, after heartbreaks that would have broken a lesser competitor, Dale Earnhardt won the Daytona 500. The moment is preserved in one of the most famous images in racing history. As Earnhardt drove down pit road after crossing the finish line, every crew member from every team in the garage area lined the pit wall to congratulate him. They reached out their hands, palms open, and Earnhardt slapped them as he rolled past, his arm extended from the window of the car in a gesture of pure, unbridled, childlike joy. The man who had earned a reputation for stoic toughness, who rarely showed emotion in public, who hid behind sunglasses and a carefully cultivated facade of invulnerability, was visibly overcome. In victory lane, with his crew surrounding him and the confetti falling around the car, tears streamed down his face as he held the Harley J. Earl trophy aloft. It was the culmination of a career. It was the vindication of a lifetime. It was the moment that proved that even the most relentless competitor, even the hardest man in the sport, could be brought to his knees by the weight of a dream finally realized after 2 decades of denial. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. The man who won 76 races, who claimed 7 championships, who was feared and revered in equal measure by everyone who ever strapped into a race car alongside him, did not die as a champion crossing the finish line in glory. He died on the last lap of a race in which he was running third, blocking for his son and his teammate, using his body and his car as a shield, so that the people he loved most could taste the victory he had spent a lifetime chasing. The Intimidator's final act was not one of aggression. It was not one of self-interest. It was one of sacrifice. And that distinction between the public persona and the private heart is what transforms the story of Dale Earnhardt from a sports tragedy into something closer to a parable about the nature of love, duty, and the things we are willing to give for the people who carry our name. The career of Dale Earnhardt was built on moments, not just victories, though there were 76 of those across 27 seasons of Winston Cup competition, but moments of confrontation, of will, of decisions made at 200 miles per hour that revealed something essential about the character of the man behind the wheel. To understand the full arc of his career, and to understand why his death landed with such devastating force on the sport and its community, you have to examine these moments closely because they are the threads from which the legend was woven. The first of these defining moments came not in Earnhardt's career directly, but in the event that set the stage for everything that followed. On February 18th, 1979, the Daytona 500 was broadcast live and in full-on network television for the first time in the race's history. CBS carried the broadcast, and the timing could not have been more fortunate for the sport. A massive winter storm had blanketed much of the eastern United States in snow, trapping millions of Americans indoors with nothing to do but turn on their televisions and search for something to watch. What they found was a stock car race from sunny Florida, and what they saw that afternoon changed the trajectory of American motorsport forever. Richard Petty, Cale Yarborough, and Donnie Allison battled for the lead in the closing laps. On the final lap, Yarborough and Allison made contact while racing side by side for the win. Both cars crashed into the infield grass, sliding to a stop as Richard Petty slipped past to take the checkered flag. But the drama did not end there. As the cameras captured the aftermath, Yarborough and Allison, joined by Donnie's brother Bobby, engaged in a fistfight on the backstretch grass of Daytona International Speedway. The brawl was captured on live television, broadcast into the living rooms of an estimated 15 million snowbound viewers, and stock car racing, which had been a regional passion, largely confined to the American South and the rural pockets of the East Coast, became a national conversation overnight. Dale Earnhardt was in the field that day, his rookie season still a few weeks from officially beginning. He finished 8th, a respectable result for a young driver in his first Daytona 500. But more important than his finishing position was his presence at the birth of a new era. The sport was changing, the television money was growing, the sponsorship dollars were expanding, the audience was widening from a regional following into a national fan base. And the driver who could dominate in this new era, the driver who could win races and capture the imagination of this expanded audience, would become something more than a race car driver. He would become a cultural figure. Earnhardt watched that transformation begin, and he understood, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries, what it meant and how to position himself within it. Earnhardt's 1980 championship season was the announcement of his arrival, a statement that could not be ignored, but it was the sequence of championship seasons in the mid to late 1980s that cemented his status as the most dominant driver of his generation. The 1987 season, in particular, stands as one of the greatest individual performances in the history of stock car racing. 11 victories in 29 starts, a winning percentage that left the competition searching for explanations. Earnhardt did not simply win races that year. He crushed the field with a relentlessness that made the championship mathematically assured well before the final races of the season. But 1987 also produced one of the most famous and controversial moments of Earnhardt's career, a moment that crystallized both the brilliance and the divisiveness of his approach to racing. At the Winston, an all-star exhibition race held at Charlotte Motor Speedway in May, Earnhardt found himself in a battle with Bill Elliott that has become the stuff of racing legend. Elliott, known as Awesome Bill from Dawsonville, was one of the most popular drivers in the sport, a clean-cut Georgian whose prodigious speed had earned him 3 wins, and the Winston Million bonus in 1985, a feat that required winning 3 of NASCAR's 4 crown jewel events in a single season. The Winston was a non-points event, a sprint race with a format designed to produce close, aggressive racing, and it delivered. In the closing laps, Earnhardt and Elliott swapped the lead multiple times, racing side by side through the corners at speeds that exceeded 160 miles per hour. The crowd was on its feet. The television cameras were locked on the 2 cars as they dove into the turns together, neither driver willing to yield an inch. On the final lap, Earnhardt made his move. Entering the final turn, he dove to the inside of Elliott's car. The 2 machines made contact. Elliott's car was pushed up the track, scraped the outside wall, and spun. Earnhardt crossed the finish line first, under a shower of boos from the Elliott fans in the crowd and cheers from the Earnhardt faithful. The incident became known simply as the pass in the grass, although the name is somewhat misleading. Earnhardt's car did brush the grass on the apron of the track during the sequence, adding to the spectacle, but the decisive moment was the contact between the 2 cars. Was it a racing incident? Was it intentional? Was it fair? The debate raged in the days and weeks that followed, and it has never fully been resolved. What is undeniable is that the moment crystallized the divide at the heart of Dale Earnhardt's career. Was he a racer or a rogue, a champion or a bully, a genius or a menace? The answer, as it often is with complex figures who operate at the extremes of their profession, was all of the above, and the willingness of the audience to argue about it, passionately and endlessly, was precisely what made Earnhardt the most compelling figure in the sport. The rivalry with Bill Elliott was significant, defined by mutual respect beneath a surface of competitive tension. But it was the rivalry with Jeff Gordon that defined the final and most commercially successful chapter of Earnhardt's competitive life, and indeed the most commercially successful chapter in the history of NASCAR itself. Jeff Gordon arrived in the Winston Cup Series in 1993, a 21-year-old from Pittsboro, Indiana, by way of Vallejo, California, driving for Rick Hendrick's rapidly growing motorsport operation. Gordon was young, clean-cut, articulate, and fast. He was everything that Earnhardt was not, at least on the surface. Where Earnhardt was the working-class hero, with calloused hands and a southern drawl, Gordon was the product of a meticulously planned career path, a driver who had been identified as a prodigy in his childhood, groomed through midget cars and sprint cars, and placed in top-tier equipment at the earliest possible moment. Where Earnhardt wore dark sunglasses and a mustache and projected an air of quiet menace, Gordon wore a boyish grin and gave polished interviews that played well on the network broadcasts. Where Earnhardt's fans were overwhelmingly blue-collar, southern, and fiercely tribal in their loyalty, Gordon attracted a younger, more suburban, more geographically diverse following. The two camps collided at racetracks across the country throughout the 1990s, and the energy generated by their rivalry was the fuel that propelled NASCAR from a successful regional sport into a national entertainment juggernaut. Television ratings soared, attendance records fell, sponsorship deals multiplied. New tracks were built in markets that had never hosted stock car racing, from Las Vegas to Chicago to Kansas City. The sport's revenue grew from hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, and at the center of it all, driving the narrative that captured the public imagination, were the black number 3 and the rainbow-colored number 24. The numbers are striking when you compare the two drivers during this period. Between 1995 and 2001, Jeff Gordon won 4 Winston Cup championships. Earnhardt won none after his 7th title in 1994. Gordon's Hendrick Motorsports operation had become the dominant force in the garage area, leveraging superior engineering resources, cutting-edge technology, and a depth of talent that Richard Childress Racing struggled to match. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the sport knew it. The torch was being passed, whether the fans on either side of the divide wanted to acknowledge it or not. Gordon's success stung Earnhardt in ways that went beyond the professional. The two men came from fundamentally different worlds, and the contrast between them became a proxy for a larger cultural tension that was playing out across the American sporting landscape. Earnhardt represented the old way, the way of earned calluses and hard knocks, the way of a man who had clawed his way to the top from nothing, and who carried the scars of that ascent with pride. Gordon represented the new way, the way of scientific preparation, of data-driven decision-making, of a career managed with the same precision that an investment banker might bring to a portfolio. Neither way was inherently superior to the other. But to the fans who aligned themselves with one side or the other, the distinction was absolute and non-negotiable. You were an Earnhardt fan or a Gordon fan. There was no middle ground. The animosity between the two fan bases was at times remarkable in its intensity. Gordon was booed mercilessly at tracks across the country, particularly at the venues in the South, where Earnhardt's support was strongest. Signs in the grandstands mocked his appearance, his background, his driving style, and his perceived softness. Earnhardt's fans wore their contempt for Gordon as a badge of honor, a declaration that they stood with the old guard against the encroaching tide of modernity. Gordon's fans, meanwhile, pointed to the championship results and argued that results were the only metric that mattered. The debate raged in every bar, every barbershop, every break room, and every internet message board where racing fans gathered to discuss the sport they loved. Earnhardt himself maintained a complicated public relationship with Gordon. He respected Gordon's talent openly and occasionally praised his driving ability in media interviews. but he also competed against him with an intensity that occasionally crossed the line from aggressive to antagonistic. At Bristol Motor Speedway in 1999, Earnhardt bumped Gordon out of the way on the final lap to steal a victory that Gordon had appeared to have in hand. The crowd erupted. The move was vintage Earnhardt, a brazen assertion of physical dominance that would have drawn a penalty in almost any other form of motorsport, but was accepted, even celebrated, in the culture of stock car racing. Gordon was furious. His post-race comments barely concealed his anger. But there was nothing he could do about it. The rules, such as they were, permitted the kind of contact that Earnhardt had initiated, and the fans, at least those who wore the number 3, loved every second of it. The Bristol bump, as it came to be called, was replayed on highlight reels for years afterward, a perfect encapsulation of the Earnhardt ethos. If you want the win badly enough, and if you have the skill and the nerve to take it, then the win is yours. No apologies, no regrets, just the trophy and the satisfaction of knowing that you did whatever was necessary to get it. Behind the scenes, the two men had a relationship that was more nuanced than the public rivalry suggested. They were not friends in the traditional sense. They were too different, too competitive, too invested in their respective identities to share the easy camaraderie that characterizes some racing partnerships. But there was a mutual recognition, an acknowledgement that each man needed the other to define himself against. Earnhardt needed Gordon as the foil, who proved that the old ways still had value. Gordon needed Earnhardt as the standard against which his own achievements could be measured. Without the other, each man's story would have been less compelling. But Earnhardt refused to go quietly. He continued to race with the same intensity and aggression that had defined his entire career, even as the victories became less frequent and the championship contention became less consistent. He adapted his style to the changing competitive landscape, relying more on experience and racecraft as the raw speed advantage he had enjoyed in the 80s began to diminish. He remained a factor at every race, a driver who could contend for the win on any given Sunday, even if the sustained dominance of his championship years was no longer achievable. The second major moment that demands examination in the context of Earnhardt's career is the crash at Talladega Superspeedway in July of 1996 that could have ended not just his season, but his life. The race was the die-hard 500, one of the 2 annual restrictor plate events at Talladega. On lap 73, Earnhardt's car was collected in a multi-car accident on the front straightaway. The contact sent his car airborne, and it barrel-rolled violently down the track, tumbling end over end in a sequence that lasted several horrifying seconds. With each rotation, pieces of bodywork, sheet metal, and mechanical components were torn from the car and scattered across the racing surface. The car finally came to rest upright on the grass of the front stretch infield, battered almost beyond recognition. The crowd of more than 150,000 spectators fell silent. The wreckage was extensive. The car looked as though it had been put through an industrial crusher. Television commentators fell quiet, the pause itself conveying the gravity of the situation more effectively than any words could have. Emergency crews rushed to the car, and then, to the astonishment and relief of everyone watching, Dale Earnhardt climbed from the wreckage under his own power. He was bruised. He was battered. He was shaken in a way that his public persona rarely allowed him to show. But he was alive. He was standing. And he was, despite the violence of what had just happened, essentially intact. The medical evaluation revealed a cracked sternum and a cracked collarbone. These were serious injuries, the kind that in most professions would require weeks or months of recovery and rehabilitation. Earnhardt missed not a single race. He showed up at the next event on the schedule, climbed into the car with his injuries still healing, his chest wrapped in tape and padding, and competed. He did not win. He was not physically capable of performing at his normal level. But he was there. He was in the car. He was racing. And the act of showing up, of refusing to sit out, of insisting that pain was a condition to be endured rather than a reason to stop, became one of the most celebrated examples of toughness in the history of the sport. The reaction was predictable and telling. Fans praised his courage. Competitors shook their heads in disbelief. Media commentators marveled at his durability. The narrative was one of heroic toughness, of a man who was simply too tough to be stopped, and there was truth in that narrative. Dale Earnhardt was an extraordinarily resilient human being, both physically and psychologically. He had spent his entire life absorbing punishment and continuing forward, from the poverty of his youth to the crashes of his racing career. The Talladega rollover was simply the most dramatic example of a pattern that had defined him since childhood. But there was another way to read the moment, a reading that only became clear in retrospect. Earnhardt's willingness to race with broken bones was not just toughness. It was also an expression of the same resistance to caution, the same prioritization of competition over self-preservation, that would ultimately contribute to his death. The culture that celebrated his refusal to sit out was the same culture that questioned the need for head and neck restraints. The mindset that said a real racer does not let pain stop him was the same mindset that said a real racer does not need to be told what safety equipment to wear. The line between courage and recklessness is thin, and in Dale Earnhardt's world that line was drawn not by institutional mandate, but by personal judgment. And personal judgment, however sharp, is not immune to the distortions of culture and ego. And it gets harder to understand when you consider how many warning signs the sport ignored, how many near misses were absorbed into the mythology of toughness, rather than treated as the urgent red flags they actually were. The Talladega crash was not an isolated incident. Throughout the mid to late 1990s, the restrictor plate tracks produced crashes of escalating violence. Multi-car pileups at Daytona and Talladega sent cars airborne, launched them into catch fences, and scattered debris across hundreds of yards of racing surface. Drivers walked away from these crashes, and each successful escape reinforced the comforting narrative that the cars were safe enough, that the roll cages were strong enough, that the drivers were tough enough to survive whatever the sport threw at them. But survival is not the same as safety. A driver who walks away from a crash with broken bones, a concussion, and soft tissue damage has survived, but he has not been kept safe. The distinction matters because it reveals the sport's fundamental misunderstanding of what safety actually means. Safety is not the absence of death. Safety is the systematic reduction of risk through engineering, regulation, and protocol. And by that definition, NASCAR in the late 1990s was not a safe sport, it was a survivable sport. And the margin between survival and death was thinner than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The medical response capabilities at the tracks had improved significantly by the late 90s. Each event featured a fully staffed in-field care centre with emergency physicians, trauma nurses, and diagnostic equipment. Helicopters were on standby for rapid transport to regional trauma centres. The safety crews, the men and women who rushed to the scene of every crash, were trained professionals who could extract an injured driver from a wrecked car in minutes. But all of these capabilities were reactive. They treated the consequences of crashes. They did not prevent the crashes from causing severe injuries in the first place. The best emergency response in the world cannot undo the damage inflicted by a basilar skull fracture in the 200 milliseconds it takes to occur. The third defining moment in Earnhardt's later career was the establishment and growth of Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, the racing team that represented his vision for his legacy beyond his own driving career. DEI was not a vanity project. It was a serious, well-funded racing operation that Earnhardt built from the ground up, starting in the early 1980s with late model and Busch Series entries, and expanding into the Winston Cup Series by the late 1990s. The DEI race shop in Mooresville, North Carolina, was a state-of-the-art facility that reflected Earnhardt's ambitions and his attention to detail. He was involved in every aspect of the operation, from driver selection to engine development to sponsor negotiations. He poured millions of dollars into the enterprise, and he hired talented people to run it. The team's Busch Series program produced victories and championships. Its Winston Cup program, launched with Steve Park and later expanded to include Michael Waltrip and Dale Earnhardt Jr., showed steady improvement. The hiring of Michael Waltrip in particular was a decision that reflected a side of Earnhardt that the public rarely saw. Waltrip was a journeyman driver, a likable, talented racer who had gone winless in more than 460 Winston Cup starts despite consistent effort and undeniable car control skills. His career had been a study in frustration, a long sequence of competitive performances that never quite translated into victories. Earnhardt saw something in Waltrip that others had overlooked, a combination of talent, determination, and character that he believed could be unlocked with the right equipment and the right team behind him. The decision to hire Waltrip was an act of faith, and it was repaid in the cruelest possible way on the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500 when Waltrip crossed the finish line first for his first career victory as Earnhardt's car hit the wall behind him. The fourth major moment was the Daytona 500 of 1998, the race that finally delivered the victory Earnhardt had been chasing for 2 decades. The full weight of that moment cannot be appreciated without understanding the depth of the frustration that preceded it. 20 years. 19 failed attempts. Heartbreaks that ranged from the absurd, a bolt on the racetrack, cutting a tyre with the finish line in sight, to the routine, a pit strategy that did not work out, a car that faded in the final laps. The Daytona 500 had become Earnhardt's Moby Dick, the obsession that defined and tormented him in equal measure. The 1998 race unfolded with excruciating tension. Earnhardt ran near the front for most of the afternoon, his car fast and stable in a way that gave his fans reason to hope and his competitors reason to worry. In the closing laps, he moved to the front of the field and held the lead through the final rounds of green flag racing. When the checkered flag fell and it was confirmed that Dale Earnhardt had won the Daytona 500, the response from the racing community was unlike anything seen before or since in the sport. As Earnhardt made his way down pit road, every crew member from every team stepped out and extended their hands. It did not matter that they worked for rival organizations. It did not matter that many of them had cursed Earnhardt's name after he bumped their driver out of the way at Bristol or Martinsville. In that moment, the entire garage area acknowledged that they had witnessed the completion of something epic, something that transcended the normal boundaries of team loyalty and competitive rivalry. Earnhardt reached out through the window of his car and slapped their hands as he rolled past, his arm extended like a king receiving the tribute of his subjects. In victory lane, the mask came off, the sunglasses were removed, the tears fell freely. The man who had spent his career cultivating an image of impenetrable toughness stood in front of the cameras and wept with joy. He held the trophy above his head with trembling hands. He embraced his crew. He kissed his wife, and he said, in a voice thick with emotion, that the Daytona 500 had been the one he wanted the most, that it meant more to him than any of the 7 championships, that the weight of 20 years of trying had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The victory changed something in the public perception of Earnhardt. He had always been respected as a competitor. He had always been admired for his toughness and his talent. But the vulnerability he showed in victory lane at Daytona, the tears, the trembling, the unguarded emotion of a man who had carried a burden for 20 years and had finally set it down, revealed a dimension of his character that the public had not been allowed to see before. He was not just the Intimidator. He was a human being who wanted something so badly that its achievement overwhelmed the defenses he had spent a lifetime constructing. And the fans, even the ones who had spent years booing him at every track on the circuit, could not help but be moved by the sight of that tough, impenetrable man standing in the Florida sunshine with tears streaming down his face. The 1999 and 2000 seasons saw Earnhardt continuing to compete at the Cup level while devoting increasing attention to his ownership role at DEI. He won 3 races in 1999, including a dominant performance at Talladega that reminded the sport that the old lion still had teeth. The 2000 season was less productive in terms of victories, with just 2 wins, but Earnhardt remained a consistent top 10 competitor and showed flashes of the brilliance that had defined his prime years. He was 49 years old, an age at which most athletes in most sports have long since retired. But race car drivers, particularly those with Earnhardt's experience and skill set, can compete at high levels well into their 40s and 50s. The physical demands of stock car racing are significant but manageable for a fit, experienced professional. The mental demands, the ability to process information at high speed, to make split-second decisions, to maintain concentration over the course of a 3-hour race, are if anything enhanced by experience. Earnhardt knew the tracks, he knew the competitors, he knew the strategy, he knew the draft. What he lacked in the raw reflexes of youth, he more than compensated for with the accumulated wisdom of 27 years behind the wheel. The relationship between Earnhardt and his fellow competitors during these final seasons was characterized by a mutual respect that had deepened with time. Drivers who had once feared and resented his aggressive tactics now viewed him with a mixture of admiration and affection. He was the elder statesman of the Gurge area, the living connection to an era that was rapidly receding into history. Younger drivers sought his advice. Veterans reminisced about battles shared on tracks from Daytona to Darlington. Even Jeff Gordon, whose rivalry with Earnhardt had generated so much heat during the 90s, spoke publicly about his respect for the older driver and the lessons he had learned from competing against him. There was a sense, among those who knew Earnhardt well, that the final years of his driving career represented a kind of reckoning with mortality that the younger Earnhardt had never been willing to entertain. He was not afraid. Fear was an emotion that Dale Earnhardt simply did not permit himself to experience in any visible way, but he was aware, in a manner that his younger self had not been, that the window of opportunity for the things that mattered most to him was closing. His body was older. The aches lasted longer. The recovery from the physical demands of a 500-mile race took more out of him than it had a decade earlier. He could feel the years accumulating in his joints, in his back, in the muscles of his neck and shoulders that bore the strain of managing a 3,400-pound machine at nearly 200 miles per hour. And yet he continued. He continued because he could not imagine not continuing. The act of driving a race car was so deeply woven into the fabric of his identity that to stop would have been to lose a part of himself that he could not afford to surrender. He had been Dale Earnhardt, the race car driver, for so long that the distinction between the man and the profession had ceased to exist. They were one and the same. The car was an extension of his body. The track was his office, his sanctuary, his battlefield. To walk away from it would have been to walk away from everything he was. This refusal to envision a life beyond racing made the events of February 18th, 2001, all the more devastating. The sport did not simply lose a driver that day. It lost a man who was still actively competing, still contributing, still showing up every Sunday with the intention of winning, or at the very least of helping the people he loved win. He was not a retired legend whose death could be mourned at a comfortable remove from the action. He was in the car. He was in the race. He was doing the thing he had done every weekend for 27 years. And then, in an instant measured in milliseconds, he was gone. The image of Earnhardt in Victory Lane at Daytona in 1998 is one of the most reproduced photographs in the history of American motorsport. It captures a man at the summit of a journey that most people cannot imagine undertaking, much less completing. The persistence required to come back year after year after year, to face the same disappointment, to endure the same heartbreak, and to show up the next February with the same belief that this would be the year, this would be the race, this would be the day, is a quality that goes beyond athletic talent. It is a quality of character, of spirit, of an unwillingness to accept defeat as anything other than a temporary setback. The fifth and final moment was the race itself, the Daytona 500 of 2001. The race that would be Dale Earnhardt's last. In the weeks leading up to that race, Earnhardt was in a reflective mood. Those close to him noticed a change, subtle but present. He spoke more openly about his pride in his son, who was entering his second full season in the Winston Cup series and had already shown himself to be a competitive force. He expressed satisfaction with the direction of Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, which was fielding 3 cars in the Cup series and producing results that validated his investment and his vision. He seemed, for perhaps the first time in his career, to be at peace with the idea that his best days as a driver might be behind him, and that his greatest contribution to the sport going forward might be as a mentor, an owner, and a builder of teams rather than a winner of races. The 2001 Speed Weeks began with the usual mix of practice sessions, qualifying runs, and the twin qualifying races that determined the starting lineup for the 500. Both DEI cars performed well throughout the week. Michael Waltrip's car was fast. Dale Jr.'s car was competitive. Earnhardt's own Richard Childress Racing entry was solid, if not spectacular. The mood in the garage area was optimistic. The team was ready, the cars were prepared, the stage was set. On race day, Sunday, February 18th, the weather was warm and clear. The temperature hovered around 70 degrees. The sky was a deep, cloudless blue. The grandstands were full, every one of the estimated 160,000 seats occupied by fans who had come from across the country to watch the 43rd running of the Daytona 500. The television cameras were in position. The broadcast was being carried to more than 17 million households. The race began at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The field of 43 cars took the green flag and immediately began to organize themselves into the drafting packs that characterize restrictor plate racing at Daytona. Earnhardt ran in the mid-pack for the early portions of the race, conserving his car and his tires while monitoring the positions of his DEI entries. This was typical strategy for an experienced restrictor plate racer. The first half of the Daytona 500 is about survival and position. The second half is about execution, and the final 10 laps are about courage. As the race entered its final stage, the complexion of the competition changed. Michael Waltrip, in the DEI number 15 Chevrolet, moved to the front of the field. Dale Earnhardt Jr., in the DEI number 8, settled into second position, and Dale Earnhardt himself, in the Richard Childress Racing number 3, moved into third place behind them. The configuration was clear. Earnhardt was not racing for his own victory. He was blocking. He was using his car, his reputation, and his skill to hold back the rest of the field so that his son and his driver could race for the win. On the final lap, entering the tri-oval complex that encompasses turns 3 and 4 at Daytona, the field was still tightly bunched. Earnhardt was running third, with Sterling Marlin's Dodge pressing against his rear bumper. Ken Schrader's Pontiac was to Earnhardt's outside. The sequence of events that followed unfolded in less than 2 seconds, but has been analysed frame by frame in the decades since. Contact was made between Marlin's car and Earnhardt's rear bumper. Whether this contact was the initiating cause of the crash or merely a contributing factor has been debated extensively. What is known is that Earnhardt's car turned to the right, moving up the track toward the outside wall. The car slid across the racing surface, making contact with Schrader's Pontiac, and then struck the concrete retaining wall in turn 4. The angle of impact was severe. The right front of Earnhardt's car hit the wall nearly head-on at an estimated speed of between 150 and 160 miles per hour. Schrader's car, entangled with Earnhardt's, also hit the wall, but at a less severe angle. Both cars slid down the banking and came to rest on the grass of the infield apron. The crash did not look, to the millions watching on television, like a fatal incident. The cars were damaged but not destroyed. There was no fire. There was no dramatic disintegration of the vehicle. It looked, to most observers, like the kind of crash that drivers walk away from every week on the NASCAR circuit. But Dale Earnhardt did not walk away. Meanwhile, at the start-finish line, Michael Waltrip crossed under the checkered flag in first place. It was his first career Winston Cup victory, achieved in his 463rd start, and it came in the most prestigious race on the calendar. Dale Earnhardt Jr. finished second. In the immediate aftermath of the finish, Waltrip and Jr. celebrated on the front stretch, pumping their fists and performing burnouts for the crowd. They did not yet know what had happened behind them. Emergency personnel reached Earnhardt's car within seconds. Safety workers reported that Earnhardt was unconscious and unresponsive. He was extracted from the vehicle and transported by ambulance to the infield care center, where initial evaluation was performed. From there, he was transported to Halifax Medical Center in Daytona Beach. At approximately 5:16 in the evening, Eastern Standard Time, Dale Earnhardt was pronounced dead. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with basilar skull fracture. He was 50 years old. The announcement came in a press conference that has become one of the most somber and gut-wrenching moments in the history of American sports. NASCAR President Mike Helton stepped to the microphone, his face ashen, his voice barely controlled. The room was packed with reporters, broadcasters, and racing officials, all of whom sensed that the news was going to be bad, but none of whom were fully prepared for its finality. Helton spoke slowly, deliberately, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that what he was about to say would change the sport forever. He said simply that they had lost Dale Earnhardt. The room did not erupt, it did not gasp, it went silent. A silence so complete and so heavy that those who were present describe it as the loudest silence they have ever experienced. Reporters who had covered the sport for decades, who had witnessed crashes and injuries and the full range of racing drama over the course of long careers, were unable to form words. Some lowered their heads, some covered their faces, some simply stared at the podium, trying to process the impossible reality that the man who had seemed indestructible, the man who had survived a barrel roll at Talladega and raced with broken bones, the man who had defined the sport for a generation, was gone. Outside the media center, the news spread through the speedway grounds with terrifying speed. Fans who had been walking back to the parking lot, replaying the race in their minds and debating the finish, stopped in their tracks as the word reached them. Some sat down on the pavement, some held each other, some wept openly, without shame or self-consciousness, in the middle of the crowd. The grandstands, which had been emptying, seemed to freeze in place as the reality settled over the speedway like a fog. In the garage area, the devastation was total. Michael Waltrip, who had been celebrating the greatest moment of his career, learned the news and collapsed. The victory that should have been the crowning achievement of his professional life became instead the source of a grief and a guilt that he would carry for years. How do you celebrate a win that cost your friend his life? How do you reconcile the joy of a dream fulfilled with the horror of a nightmare realized? Waltrip would later describe the days and weeks that followed as the darkest period of his existence, a time when the victory trophy sat in his home like an accusation rather than an achievement. Dale Earnhardt Jr., who had finished second and should have been celebrating a remarkable 1-2 finish for his father's racing team, was devastated in a way that words cannot adequately convey. He was 26 years old. He had lost his father, not illness, not to the slow decline of old age, but to the sport that they shared, the sport that had defined their family for 3 generations, the sport that was supposed to be their common language and their shared passion. The grief was compounded by the public nature of the loss. Junior could not mourn in private. His pain was witnessed by millions, commented upon by millions, analysed and discussed by millions. The weight of that exposure, added to the weight of the loss itself, was a burden that no young man should ever have to carry. Richard Childress, Earnhardt's car owner and one of his closest friends in the world, was inconsolable. The partnership between the two men had lasted nearly 2 decades and had produced 6 of Earnhardt's 7 championships, dozens of victories, and a bond that went far beyond the professional. They were brothers in everything but blood. Childress would later say that a part of him died on that racetrack, and that the days and weeks and months that followed were the darkest of his life. He would continue to field race cars, would continue to compete, would continue to build his organization into one of the most respected in the sport. But the man who sat across from him at the strategy meetings, the man who argued with him about tire pressures and chassis adjustments and pit stop timing, the man who shared his victories and his defeats with equal intensity, was gone. And no championship, no trophy, no amount of future success could fill the space he left behind. The answer to the question that formed in the immediate aftermath of Dale Earnhardt's death is yes. His death was preventable. And that single word, that 3-letter affirmation, carries more weight than any championship trophy or victory lane celebration in the history of the sport. Not preventable in the abstract sense that all accidents are theoretically preventable if the participants simply choose not to participate. Not preventable in the philosophical sense that if Earnhardt had decided not to race that day, or had retired a year earlier, or had never taken up racing at all, he would still be alive. But preventable in the concrete, measurable, engineering verified, scientifically documented sense that a specific device existed, had been extensively tested, was commercially available for purchase, and would have, with near medical certainty, prevented the specific injury that took his life. Let that sink in. The hands device, which Dale Earnhardt chose not to wear on the day he died, was designed for the explicit purpose of preventing basilar skull fracture. Its mechanism was straightforward. The device consisted of a yoke, worn around the shoulders and beneath the seatbelt harnesses, connected to the helmet by two flexible tethers. When a driver wearing the hands device experienced a frontal impact, the tethers prevented the head from snapping forward beyond the range of motion that the cervical spine could safely accommodate. The forces that would otherwise concentrate at the base of the skull were instead distributed through the yoke and into the harness system, dissipating their energy across a larger area and reducing the peak load on the vulnerable junction between skull and spine. Dr. Robert Hubbard, the device's inventor, had spent nearly 2 decades developing, refining, testing, and promoting it. He had published papers. He had presented data at engineering conferences. He had demonstrated the device's effectiveness in controlled crash tests using instrumented anthropomorphic dummies, the same standardized crash test dummies used by the automotive industry to evaluate passenger vehicle safety. The data was unambiguous. In impacts that produced basilar skull fracture in unprotected test subjects, the hands device reduced the forces on the skull-spine junction by more than 80%. The margin of protection was not incremental. It was transformative. It was the difference between survival and death. Some drivers in the NASCAR garage area had adopted the device voluntarily. Brett Bodine wore one. Several road course specialists who had experience in sports car racing, where the hands device had gained earlier acceptance, wore one. But the majority of Cup Series drivers did not. The reasons varied from driver to driver, but the underlying theme was consistent. The device was perceived as uncomfortable. It was perceived as restrictive. It was perceived by a community that prized self-reliance and personal judgment above all else as an unnecessary intrusion into the sacred relationship between a driver and his car. Earnhardt's personal resistance to the hands device was well known within the garage area. He had tried it. He did not like it. He felt that the tethers restricted his ability to turn his head freely during close-quarters racing, particularly at the super speedways, where the ability to see the cars around him was critical for survival in the drafting packs. He preferred the freedom of an unrestrained head, the ability to swivel and look without feeling the pull of the tethers against his helmet. It was a preference rooted in competitive instinct, in the belief that the fraction of additional visibility gained by not wearing the device was worth the trade-off in crash protection. It was a calculation, a risk assessment performed by a man who had spent his entire career assessing risks at 200 miles per hour. And it was, in the final analysis, catastrophically wrong. The deaths that preceded his own should have been the loudest possible warning. Adam Petty, Kenny Irwin, Tony Roper. 3 drivers who died from basilar skull fracture in the 8 months before Earnhardt's crash. 3 deaths that screamed a message to the sport so clearly that its failure to hear it, or its choice not to act upon it, approaches the incomprehensible when viewed from the distance of more than 2 decades. Adam Petty was 19 years old. He was the grandson of Richard Petty, the great-grandson of Lee Petty, the inheritor of the most storied name in stock car racing history. His death should have shaken the sport to its foundation, and it did shake it emotionally, but it did not shake it structurally. NASCAR did not mandate the hands device after Adam Petty's death. It did not mandate it after Kenny Irwin's death 2 months later. It did not mandate it after Tony Roper's death 4 months after that. The sanctioning body studied the issue. It discussed the issue. It encouraged drivers to explore head and neck restraint options. But it did not require them. How many drivers had to die from the same injury, in the same way, from the same preventable cause, before the sport would mandate the device that would prevent it? The answer, as history recorded it, was one more. and that one was the biggest name in the sport's history. Let that sink in. NASCAR's response to Earnhardt's death was, to its credit, swift and comprehensive in a way that its responses to the previous deaths had not been. The difference was not merely bureaucratic, it was existential. The death of the sport's most iconic figure, on live television, in front of 17 million viewers, in the sport's most prestigious race, created a pressure for change that could not be deflected, delayed, or diffused through committee discussions and voluntary guidelines. The public demanded answers, the media demanded accountability, the fans demanded action, and NASCAR, recognizing that its credibility and its future depended on its response, acted with a speed and a decisiveness that had been absent in the months and years prior. Within months of Earnhardt's death, NASCAR mandated the use of head and neck restraint devices for all drivers in all three of its national touring series, the Cup Series, the Busch Series, and the Truck Series. The HANS device, or an equivalent approved alternative, became as mandatory as the helmet and the harness. The era of voluntary safety, of individual choice as the governing principle of driver protection, had ended. The era of mandated, standardized, non-negotiable safety requirements had begun. But the safety revolution did not stop with head restraints. Earnhardt's death had exposed a cascading series of vulnerabilities in the sport's safety infrastructure, vulnerabilities that extended far beyond the question of whether or not a driver wore a collar around his shoulders. The concrete walls that lined every track on the circuit were identified as a primary contributor to the severity of impact injuries. The walls were rigid, they were unyielding. When a car struck a concrete barrier at high speed, the wall absorbed almost none of the impact energy. Instead, it reflected the energy back into the car and into the driver's body, creating the sudden, massive deceleration that the human body could not withstand. The search for a better barrier led to the development and widespread installation of the steel and foam energy reduction barrier, commonly known as the safer barrier. The concept was elegant. Steel tubes, arranged in a series of frames, backed by energy-absorbing closed-cell polystyrene foam, mounted in front of the existing concrete walls. When a car struck a safer barrier, the steel tubes deformed and the foam compressed, absorbing a significant portion of the impact energy before the car's deceleration reached the concrete behind it. The reduction in peak impact forces was dramatic and measurable, on the order of 40 to 50% in many crash scenarios. The safer barrier was first installed at Indianapolis Motor Speedway in 2002 and rapidly spread to every major oval track in the country. Within a few years, every wall on every track in the NASCAR circuit was lined with safer barriers. The installation was expensive, it was logistically complex. It required cooperation between track owners, the sanctioning body, and the engineering firms that manufactured the barriers. But it was done because the alternative, the continuation of a system in which drivers were launched into unyielding concrete at 150 miles per hour, was no longer acceptable. The data collected after the installation of safer barriers confirmed what the engineering models had predicted. Impact severity, as measured by accelerometers mounted in the cars, dropped dramatically at every venue where the barriers were installed. Crashes that would have produced peak deceleration forces in excess of 80 G-forces against a concrete wall now registered in the range of 40 to 50 G-forces against the safer barrier. The difference was not academic. It was the difference between a driver walking to the ambulance and a driver being carried to the helicopter. It was the difference between a bruised chest and a shattered sternum. It was, in many cases, the difference between life and death. The safer barrier technology was eventually adopted beyond NASCAR. The IndyCar series installed the barriers at its oval track events. Short tracks and regional racing venues across the country began upgrading their facilities. International circuits took notice. The technology that had been developed in response to the death of a single driver in a single race was now protecting competitors in dozens of racing series across multiple continents. The ripple effect of Earnhardt's death reached far beyond the boundaries of stock car racing, touching every form of motorsport where cars ran near rigid walls. The research and development infrastructure that NASCAR established in the years following Earnhardt's death was itself a revolutionary change. The NASCAR Research and Development Center, established in Concord, North Carolina, became a facility dedicated to the scientific study of racing safety. Engineers and researchers used crash test data, computer simulations, and real-world accident analysis to identify vulnerabilities and develop solutions before they claimed another life. The approach was proactive rather than reactive, a fundamental shift in philosophy from the sport's historical pattern of responding to tragedies after they occurred. The center invested in instrumented crash testing, using high-speed cameras and accelerometers to capture every aspect of an impact event, measuring forces on the dummy occupant at dozens of points on the body. The data generated by these tests informed every subsequent design change, every rule modification, and every equipment mandate. The evolution of the racing seat was another critical area of improvement. The seats used in Earnhardt's era were relatively simple fiberglass or aluminum shells that held the driver in position but offered limited energy absorption during an impact. The post-Earnhardt era saw the development of custom-molded carbon fiber seats that were fitted precisely to each individual driver's body. These seats incorporated energy-absorbing materials in the headrest area and along the sides, providing additional protection against lateral and vertical forces. The seat was no longer merely a platform for the driver to sit on. It was a safety device engineered to manage the forces acting on the driver's body during a crash and to work in conjunction with the harness, the hands device, and the car's structural components to create a comprehensive occupant protection system. The cars themselves underwent a fundamental redesign. NASCAR invested years of development in what became known as the Car of Tomorrow, introduced in 2007 as a replacement for the template body cars that had been the standard since the early 1980s. The Car of Tomorrow incorporated design features specifically intended to improve crashworthiness. The driver's seating position was moved toward the center of the car, increasing the distance between the driver and the door panels, the area most vulnerable to side impact intrusion. The roll cage was strengthened and standardized, with specific requirements for tubing diameter, wall thickness, mounting angles, and construction technique that eliminated the variability that had existed when teams were allowed to design their own cage structures. Energy-absorbing foam was installed in the door panels and in the areas surrounding the driver's head and torso. These foam inserts were designed to decelerate the driver's body more gradually during a side impact, reducing the peak forces that the body experienced. The front end of the car was redesigned to incorporate crumple zones, structural elements designed to collapse in a controlled manner during a frontal impact, extending the time over which the car decelerated and reducing the peak G-forces experienced by the driver. Seat belt technology was improved and standardized. The mounting points for the 6-point harness were specified with greater precision. The webbing was upgraded to higher strength materials. The energy-absorbing properties of the harness system were enhanced. The loose belts that Earnhardt had preferred, the slack that had given him freedom of movement but had reduced his crash protection, were no longer permitted. Every driver was required to be restrained in a manner that met specific engineering criteria, and those criteria were enforced through pre-race inspections that left no room for individual preference. Helmet standards were elevated. Full-face helmets became mandatory, eliminating the open-face design that Earnhardt had worn. The helmets were required to meet higher impact standards, certified to absorb greater forces without transmitting them to the driver's skull. The integration between the helmet and the hands device was optimized so that the two components worked together as a unified system rather than as separate pieces of equipment that happened to be worn simultaneously. The window nets were redesigned. The seat construction was improved. The steering column was made collapsible, designed to telescope during a frontal impact rather than being driven backward into the driver's chest. Every element of the car that a driver's body could potentially contact during a crash was evaluated, redesigned, and tested to ensure that it contributed to the driver's survival rather than threatening it. The deeper truth of Dale Earnhardt's death is not simply that he died in a race car. Drivers had died before. The sport had mourned, had made incremental improvements, and had moved forward with the acceptance that some degree of risk was inherent in the act of racing at high speeds. The deeper truth is that his death forced a fundamental reckoning with the values that had guided stock car racing for half a century. The sport had been built on a foundation of toughness, of personal choice, of the individual's sovereign right to accept risk as he saw fit. These values were not wrong in the abstract. They reflected a culture, a tradition, a way of understanding the world that millions of Americans recognized, respected, and lived by. The idea that a man should be free to make his own decisions about his own safety without the interference of governing bodies or regulatory agencies is deeply rooted in the American character, and in many contexts, it is a value worth defending. But when those values collided with the physics of high-speed impact, the physics won, and the cost of that collision was the life of the sport's most beloved figure. The freedom to choose had produced a choice that was, in the final analysis, wrong. Not morally wrong, not intellectually wrong, but practically, physically, fatally wrong. And the sport, confronted with that reality, had no choice but to reconsider the balance between freedom and safety, between individual choice and institutional protection, between the way things had always been done and the way they needed to be done going forward. There is a temptation, when examining tragedies of this kind, to assign blame, to point fingers at NASCAR for not mandating the hands device sooner, to criticize Earnhardt for his stubbornness, to condemn the culture of toughness that discouraged drivers from embracing protective technology. But blame is too simple a framework for understanding what happened. The failure was systemic. It was embedded in the structure of the sport, in the relationships between drivers, teams, owners, sanctioning bodies, and equipment manufacturers. It was a failure of collective imagination, a shared inability to envision a world in which the unthinkable actually happened. Because Dale Earnhardt was not supposed to die. Not him. Not the Intimidator. Not the man who had survived the barrel roll at Talladega, who had raced with a cracked sternum and a cracked collarbone, who had stared down every competitor and every challenge the sport had thrown at him for 27 years and emerged battered but unbroken. If anyone was going to walk away from a crash, it was Dale Earnhardt. That was the narrative. That was the myth. And when the myth was shattered on live television, in front of 17 million viewers, the sport had no choice but to confront the reality that myths do not override physics. The personal toll on those closest to Earnhardt was immense and enduring. Teresa Earnhardt, Dale's third wife, retreated from public life in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. The management of Dale Earnhardt Incorporated fell to her, and the decisions she made in the years that followed became sources of controversy and family conflict. The relationship between Teresa and Dale Jr. deteriorated, eventually leading Jr. to leave DEI and sign with Hendrick Motorsports, a move that was accompanied by public acrimony and legal disputes over the use of the Earnhardt name, and the disposition of Dale Sr.'s personal effects. Dale Earnhardt Jr. continued to race, carrying the impossible weight of his father's legacy every time he climbed into a car. The pressure was extraordinary and unrelenting. Fans who had loved his father transferred their devotion to him wholesale, expecting him to fill shoes that no one could fill, to drive with the same aggression, to win with the same frequency, to project the same aura of invincibility. Junior was a talented driver in his own right, winning 19 Cup races and 2 Daytona 500 victories over the course of his career. But he was a different kind of competitor than his father had been. He was quieter, more introspective, more willing to acknowledge the emotional cost of what he did for a living. In the years after his retirement from driving, Junior spoke openly about the impact of his father's death on his mental health. He discussed anxiety. He discussed the burden of expectation. He discussed the strange and isolating experience of being the most popular driver in the sport while privately wrestling with a grief that never fully resolved itself. He became one of the first major figures in American motorsport to talk candidly about the psychological dimension of racing, about the toll that danger, loss, and relentless public scrutiny take on the human mind. In doing so, he opened a door that his father, bound by the conventions of his generation and his culture, could never have opened. the broader motorsport community felt the impact of Earnhardt's death in ways that extended beyond the specific safety reforms enacted by NASCAR. A conversation about driver safety that his death ignited spread to every corner of the racing world. Formula One, which had already undergone significant safety improvements in the years following Ayrton Senna's death in 1994, accelerated its own research and development programs. The FIA mandated the use of the hands device in Formula One beginning in 2003. IndyCar followed with its own mandate. Sports car racing organizations worldwide adopted head and neck restraint requirements. The effect was cascading and comprehensive. A death in American stock car racing had triggered a global safety revolution that touched every form of motorsport, from the highest levels of international competition to the local short tracks where Saturday night racers competed for modest purses and bragging rights. The legal aftermath of Earnhardt's death was also significant. Teresa Earnhardt fought to prevent the release of Dale's autopsy photographs, a battle that raised important questions about the balance between public interest and family privacy. The Florida legislature eventually passed a law restricting public access to autopsy photos, a piece of legislation that became known informally as the Earnhardt Law. The legal proceedings also prompted investigations into the specific mechanical factors that contributed to the severity of the crash, including questions about whether Earnhardt's seatbelt had failed during the impact. An independent investigation concluded that the left lap belt had separated, allowing Earnhardt's body to move forward inside the cockpit beyond the range of protection that the harness was designed to provide. The finding underscored yet another layer of the systemic failure. It was not just the absence of the hands device. It was not just the concrete wall. It was also the potential failure of basic equipment, a seatbelt that may not have held, that contributed to the unsurvivable outcome. NASCAR commissioned its own investigation, led by Director of Safety Tommy Gideon and supported by external engineering consultants. The investigation produced a detailed analysis of the crash dynamics, the structural performance of the car, and the medical findings. Its conclusions informed many of the specific rule changes that followed, from the belt inspection protocols to the wall construction standards to the helmet requirements. The transparency of the investigation, while imperfect and criticized by some, represented a departure from the sport's historical tendency to treat crashes as acts of fate, rather than engineering events that could be analyzed, understood, and prevented. The insurance and liability implications of Earnhardt's death rippled through the sport's financial structure. Track owners faced new scrutiny regarding the safety of their facilities. The cost of upgrading walls, installing safer barriers, and meeting the new safety standards placed significant financial burdens on smaller venues that operated on thin margins. Some tracks closed rather than make the required investments. Others found creative financing solutions, including partnerships with NASCAR and state governments, to fund the upgrades. The economic landscape of stock car racing was permanently altered by the cascade of safety requirements that followed the crash at Daytona, a reminder that the consequences of a single event can extend far beyond the immediate tragedy and reshape the structures that surround it. The cultural impact of the safety revolution extended into how the sport discussed and processed risk itself. Before Earnhardt's death, the language of the garage area was dominated by euphemism and denial. Crashes were incidents. Injuries were bumps and bruises. The possibility of death was the subject that no one mentioned, the elephant in the room that everyone agreed to ignore, because acknowledging it would have required confronting the inadequacy of the protections in place. After Earnhardt's death, that language changed. The sport began to speak openly about risk, about the physics of impact, about the engineering of survival. Drivers discussed safety in interviews without fear of being labeled soft. Crew chiefs incorporated crash protection into their design philosophies alongside performance. The sanctioning body published safety research and invited public scrutiny of its findings. This shift in language reflected a deeper shift in values. The sport had moved, in the span of a few years, from a culture that treated danger as a badge of honor to one that treated safety as a professional obligation. The transition was not seamless. There were drivers and fans who mourned the loss of the old ethos, who felt that the mandates and the regulations had stripped the sport of some essential wildness that had made it special. But the numbers spoke for themselves. The crashes continued, because crashes are an inevitable feature of high-speed racing. The deaths did not, and in the calculus of human life, that was the only number that truly mattered. The question of whether Dale Earnhardt would have approved of the changes his death inspired is one that his family, his friends, and his fans have debated in the years since. The man who resisted the hands device, who preferred an open-face helmet, who ran his belts loose because it gave him a competitive edge, might well have chafed at the mandates that now govern every aspect of driver safety. He was a man who valued freedom, who believed in the individual's right to make his own choices, who distrusted institutional authority in all its forms. The safety revolution that bears his legacy runs counter to many of the principles he lived by. And yet, if the choice were between his own discomfort and the survival of other drivers, those who knew him best believe he would have accepted the trade, because beneath the persona of the Intimidator, beneath the sunglasses and the scowl and the aggressive driving style, was a man who cared deeply about the people around him, a man who blocked for his son on the last lap of his life, a man whose final act was one of protection, not aggression. Richard Childress never fielded the number 3 car again in the Cup Series. The number was retired, not by formal decree, but by the unspoken understanding that it belonged to one man and one man alone. Other drivers would not have asked for it. Other owners would not have offered it. The number 3 was Dale Earnhardt's. It would always be Dale Earnhardt's. Childress continued to build his racing organization, winning races and championships with other drivers, expanding into other series, and establishing himself as one of the most successful team owners in the history of the sport. But those who knew him best said that the fire dimmed after Earnhardt's death, that the championships won afterward, while meaningful, carried a different weight, that the seat across the table, the one where Dale used to sit during strategy meetings, was never really filled again. In the 2 decades following Dale Earnhardt's death, through the end of the 2020 season, no driver died in a NASCAR Cup Series race. Not one. That fact is the most powerful statistic in the entire story. More powerful than 7 championships. More powerful than 76 victories. More powerful than any lap time or qualifying speed or points total. In a sport where cars travel at nearly 200 miles per hour, where crashes are frequent and violent, where the laws of physics are tested with every lap, not a single driver lost his life in the Premier Series for 20 years after the safety reforms inspired by Earnhardt's death. That is his legacy. That is the thing he gave to the sport without meaning to give it. That is the gift that cost him everything. The weight of that gift is felt most acutely by those who survived crashes that would have killed them in an earlier era. Ryan Newman's crash in the 2020 Daytona 500 was hauntingly similar to Earnhardt's, a last-lap impact into the Turn 4 wall at nearly the same speed. Newman's car was struck, turned sideways, hit the wall, was struck again, and rolled onto its roof before sliding to a stop engulfed in sparks. The crash looked unsurvivable. Newman survived. He walked out of the hospital within days. The safer barrier absorbed the energy. The hands device protected his skull. The redesigned car maintained the integrity of the driver's compartment. Every innovation born from Earnhardt's death worked exactly as designed. Newman lived because Earnhardt did not. What does Dale Earnhardt mean to auto racing today? The question seems simple enough, the kind of question a journalist might pose in a post-race interview or a television host might ask during a retrospective segment. But the answer is layered and complex, woven through the identities of millions of fans who still carry his memory more than 2 decades after his death, and embedded in the physical infrastructure of every racetrack in the country. On the surface, the legacy is statistical: 7 championships, 76 victories, 428 top 10 finishes across 676 career starts. A career that spanned from 1975 to 2001, covering some of the most transformative and turbulent years in the history of stock car racing. Earnhardt was inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame in its inaugural class in 2010, alongside Richard Petty, Junior Johnson, Bill France Sr., and Bill France Jr. The company he keeps in that first class tells you everything you need to know about his standing in the sports hierarchy. He is not simply among the greats. He is at the very pinnacle, occupying the same rarefied air as the men who founded the sport and the men who defined it before he arrived. But statistics, however impressive, do not capture the full measure of what Dale Earnhardt represented to the people who followed him. He was a symbol of something larger than racing, something that connected to the identity and the aspirations of millions of Americans who saw in him a reflection of their own lives. He was the working-class hero in a sport born from working-class roots. He was the man who did not have advantages, who did not come from wealth or privilege, who did not have the backing of a famous racing name or a powerful family fortune. He earned everything he achieved through effort, through talent, and through an iron unwillingness to accept anything less than his absolute best on any given day. In a sport that was increasingly corporatized during the 1990s, increasingly polished and packaged for national television consumption, increasingly driven by marketing budgets and sponsorship deals and focus groups, Earnhardt remained stubbornly authentic. He spoke in the plain, direct manner of a man who had grown up in a mill town and never felt the need to adopt the polished cadences of corporate America. He drove aggressively, unapologetically, in an era when other drivers were being coached to present a smoother, more sponsor-friendly image. He did not apologize for who he was or how he raced. And in an era when professional athletes across all sports were becoming increasingly distant from the fans who supported them, retreating behind layers of management and public relations handlers, Earnhardt maintained a connection with his audience that was rooted in shared experience and mutual recognition. His fans were not mere spectators. They were participants in a relationship that transcended the boundaries of the racetrack. They wore his merchandise, not as fashion statements, but as declarations of allegiance. They displayed the number 3 on their vehicles, their homes, their workplaces, not because it was trendy, but because it represented something they believed in. When they cheered for Earnhardt, they were cheering for themselves, for the idea that a person who starts with nothing can, through sheer force of will, rise to the top of a competitive world that does not care about your background, your education, or your pedigree. The Earnhardt legacy extends beyond the man himself and into the next generation. Dale Earnhardt Jr. became the most popular driver in NASCAR for 15 consecutive years, a streak that no other driver in the sport's history has matched. That popularity was driven in part by Jr.'s own talent and personality, but it was sustained and amplified by the devotion of fans who had loved his father and transferred that devotion to his son. The Earnhardt name remained the most recognizable brand in stock car racing for the better part of 2 decades after Dale Sr.'s death, a testament to the enduring power of the connection he built during his lifetime. Richard Childress Racing continued to be a significant force in the sport, winning races and championships with drivers like Kevin Harvick, who inherited the ride that had belonged to Earnhardt and won the championship in 2014. The race shop in Welcome, North Carolina, contains the Dale Earnhardt Museum, a collection of cars, trophies, uniforms, and memorabilia that draws visitors from across the country and around the world. The museum is not a shrine in the religious sense, but it serves a similar function. It is a place where people come to remember, to pay respect, and to reconnect with a figure who meant more to them than they can easily express. But perhaps the most enduring and consequential element of Earnhardt's legacy is the safety revolution his death inspired. Every HANS device worn by every driver in every form of motorsport, every safer barrier installed at every oval track in the country, every redesigned car that enters the racetrack with crumple zones and energy-absorbing door panels and standardized roll cage construction, every full-face helmet mandate, every seatbelt inspection, every pre-race safety briefing, all of it, every single element, traces its lineage directly to the tragedy of February 18, 2001. Every driver who walks away from a crash that would have been fatal a quarter century ago is walking away because Dale Earnhardt did not. There is a philosophical dimension to this legacy that deserves thoughtful consideration. Dale Earnhardt lived his life by a code: work hard, race hard, never give an inch, never show weakness, never let anyone see you vulnerable. It was a code inherited from his father, reinforced by the culture in which he was raised, and validated by decades of competitive success. It was a code that served him brilliantly on the racetrack and made him a champion 7 times over. But it was the same code that led him to reject the safety equipment that could have saved his life. The very qualities that made him great, his stubbornness, his toughness, his refusal to be told what to do by anyone, were the same qualities that contributed to his death. This is not an indictment of the man. It is an observation about the complexity of human character and the way our greatest strengths can, under specific circumstances, become our greatest vulnerabilities. Dale Earnhardt was not a reckless man in the conventional sense. He was a principled man whose principles, forged in the crucible of a hard life and a harder sport, did not account for the possibility that toughness alone could not protect him from the immutable laws of physics. He had survived so much. He had endured so many crashes, so many injuries, so many moments that should have been his last. And each survival reinforced the belief that he was, in some fundamental way, exempt from the consequences that befell lesser men. He was not exempt. No one is. The era he represented, the golden age of the 1990s NASCAR boom, is often viewed through a lens of deep nostalgia by those who lived through it. It was a time when the sport felt bigger, louder, more passionate, more tribal, more alive than it does today. The rivalries were personal. The racing was physical. The fan allegiances were worn like badges of honor and defended with the fervor of religious conviction. Earnhardt and Gordon, the old guard and the new wave, the black number 3 and the rainbow 24. These narratives drove the sport to heights of commercial popularity and cultural relevance it had never reached before and has struggled to reach again in the years since. When Earnhardt died, something intangible went with him. The sport did not collapse. It continued to grow, to evolve, to attract new fans and new sponsors. But there was a shift, subtle but real, in the emotional center of gravity. The authenticity that Earnhardt embodied, the raw, unvarnished connection between driver and fan, became harder to find in a sport that was becoming more professional, more corporate, more managed with every passing season. The drivers who came after Earnhardt were talented, driven, and committed, but they were products of a different system, a system designed to produce polished brand ambassadors as much as race car drivers. They were safer, they were better protected, they were, in measurable terms, better off. But something had been lost, something that no amount of engineering or marketing could replace. There is a reason why, more than 2 decades after his death, the number 3 remains the most popular and recognizable number in stock car racing. There is a reason why Dale Earnhardt merchandise continues to outsell that of many active drivers. There is a reason why, on the anniversary of his death each February, social media fills with tributes and remembrances from fans who were not yet born when he died, but who know his story as intimately as they know the stories of their own families. The reason is simple. Dale Earnhardt was not just a driver, he was a mirror. He reflected something back to the people who watched him that they recognized as themselves. And when that mirror was broken, the reflection did not disappear. It became permanent, frozen in time, preserved in the amber of collective memory. Dale Earnhardt was not perfect. He was human, with all the flaws and contradictions that humanity carries. He could be stubborn beyond reason. He could be distant from those who loved him most. He could be ruthless on the racetrack, in ways that crossed the boundary between aggressive and reckless, between competitive and dangerous. But he was also generous in ways the public rarely saw, offering financial help to struggling drivers and their families, visiting sick children in hospitals without notifying the media, performing quiet acts of kindness that only came to light in the stories told after his death. He was, in the end, a man, not a myth, not a legend, not an icon, a man. A man who was born in a small house in a mill town, who grew up in a garage, who dropped out of school, who struggled and failed and struggled again, who found his purpose behind the wheel of a race car, who achieved everything the sport had to offer, and who died doing the thing he loved most in the world. And if that is not a story worth telling, if that is not a life worth remembering, then the act of remembrance itself has lost its meaning. The annual tributes that mark the anniversary of his death each February are not organized events. They are spontaneous expressions of a grief and a gratitude that have not diminished with time. Fans gather at Daytona, at his statue in front of the speedway, and at memorials across the country to remember the man who made the number 3 means something more than an integer. They bring flowers, they bring die-cast cars, they bring memories of where they were on the day the world learned that the Intimidator was gone, memories as vivid and as specific as any they possess. The Kannapolis that raised him still stands, though the mills have closed and the economy has shifted to healthcare and technology. The garage behind the family home, where Ralph Earnhardt built engines by the light of a bare bulb, has been preserved, a modest monument to the origins of a dynasty that shaped American motorsport for 3 generations. The people who grew up alongside Dale, who knew him before the fame and the fortune and the sunglasses, remember a boy who was restless and determined in equal measure, who could not sit still in a classroom but could spend hours under a car without complaint, who wanted nothing from the world except the chance to prove that he belonged behind the wheel. The town remembers him not as a legend but as one of their own, a kid from Sedan Avenue who made good in a way that none of them could have predicted, but all of them understood. He did not leave Kannapolis behind when he became famous. He carried it with him in his accent, in his values, in his refusal to pretend to be anything other than what he was. And the town, in return, has never let go of its claim on him. There is a stretch of asphalt in Daytona Beach, Florida, where the banking rises to 31 degrees and the concrete wall stands at the edge of the racing surface, like a boundary between the knowable and the infinite. It is turn 4. It is where the back stretch straightaway gives way to the tri-oval, where the cars come off the banking, and onto the front stretch, where the finish line waits and the grandstands rise and the checkered flag falls. It is, by any objective measurement, just a section of racetrack, concrete and asphalt and paint and steel, materials that have no memory, no conscience, no capacity for sorrow. But memory lives in places whether they ask for it or not. And turn 4 at Daytona International Speedway carries a memory that will outlast the concrete itself. Dale Earnhardt was a man of contradictions, and perhaps that is why his story resonates so deeply with so many. He was feared and loved, he was ruthless and kind. He was a bully on the racetrack, and a devoted father of it, even when devotion came harder to express than aggression. He was the product of a hard world that did not forgive weakness, and he carried that world with him everywhere he went, wearing it like the black paint on his race car, a declaration to anyone who dared challenge him that they were dealing with something they could not easily overcome, something they would not soon forget. He was the son of a mill town, he was the champion of a sport, he was the driver who made the number 3 mean something more than a position on the scoring pylon. He made it a symbol, a creed, a way of understanding the world that said, "You do not give up, you do not back down, and you do not let anyone tell you what you cannot achieve." And when he died, on the last lap of the race he loved most, blocking for his son and his teammate, using his body and his machine as a shield, so that the people he cared about most in the world could cross the finish line ahead of the field, he gave the sport one final and terrible gift. He gave it the undeniable, irrefutable proof that change was necessary, that the old ways, however noble in their origins, and however deeply rooted in the culture of the sport, were not sufficient to protect the men who risked their lives every Sunday afternoon for the passion and entertainment of millions. The sport changed because of him. It changed because it had to. It changed because the cost of not changing had finally been made visible in a way that could not be ignored, rationalized, or deferred to a future committee meeting. And every driver who has climbed into a stock car since that day, every driver who has walked away from a crash that would have been fatal in a prior era, every driver who has strapped on a head and neck restraint and felt the reassurance of an energy-absorbing barrier at the edge of the track, is living proof that Dale Earnhardt's death however senseless, however preventable, however agonizing to contemplate, was not in vain. He would not have wanted to be remembered as a martyr. That word does not belong in his vocabulary. He would have wanted to be remembered as a racer, as a competitor, as the man who won 7 championships and 76 races, and the Daytona 500, and the respect of every single person who ever shared a racetrack with him. He would have wanted to be remembered for the way he drove, for the way he fought, for the way he refused to accept second place as anything other than a temporary condition that would be corrected at the first available opportunity. And he is remembered that way. He is remembered as one of the greatest drivers who ever lived, a man whose talent behind the wheel was matched only by his determination to use it. But he is also remembered as the man whose death changed everything. And that dual legacy, the champion and the catalyst, the victor and the victim, the man who lived for speed and died because the sport he loved had not yet learned how to protect him from it, is something that no other figure in the history of American motorsport can claim. It belongs to him alone. The number 3, the black car, the dark sunglasses, the mustache, the Carolina drawl that could be warm or cold depending on whether you were his friend or his competitor, the stare that could unsettle a man across a crowded garage area without a single word being spoken. These are the images that remain. These are the fragments of a life lived at full speed in every possible meaning of that phrase. A life that began in a small house in a mill town and ended against a wall in the Florida sun. A life that spanned 50 years and 7 championships, and countless moments of brilliance, courage, stubbornness, tenderness, and grace. Dale Earnhardt did not live a long life by the standards of most people. 50 years is not enough. It was not enough for him. It was not enough for his family. It was not enough for the millions who loved him. But he lived a full life, a life so densely packed with experience and achievement and struggle and triumph that it would take several ordinary lifetimes to accumulate the same weight of memory. He lived every lap, he raced every mile, he fought every battle, and in the end, he gave the sport the one thing it needed most, the one thing that would protect the lives of every driver who came after him, even though it was the one thing he should never have had to give, his life. The engines still roar at Daytona every February. The cars still circle the high banks at speeds that continue to push the boundaries of engineering and courage. The grandstands still fill with fans who wear their loyalties on their sleeves, and their heroes on their hats, and their hearts on the bumper stickers of their pickup trucks. And somewhere in that crowd, every year, without fail, there is someone wearing a number 3. Someone who was not yet born when Dale Earnhardt died, but who knows the story, who has heard it from a parent or a grandparent or a neighbor or a friend, who understands, without needing to be told, that the man who wore that number was something more than a race car driver, something more than a 7-time champion, something more than the Intimidator. He was the heartbeat of a sport, and when that heartbeat stopped, on a warm February Sunday on the last lap of the Great American Race, the sport learned, at the highest and most devastating cost imaginable, that it could no longer afford to take that heartbeat for granted. It could no longer assume that toughness was the same as safety. It could no longer believe that the men who drove these machines were invulnerable simply because they had survived so many times before. The last lap has been run. The checkered flag has fallen. The black car sits against the wall in turn 4, still and silent, while the world that loved it tries to understand what it has lost. And the number 3 remains, on bumper stickers and t-shirts and tattoos and die-cast replicas lined up on mantles in living rooms across America, on the wall of the NASCAR Hall of Fame, and in the memory of every person who ever watched that car thunder past the grandstands and felt just for a moment that the world made sense. Dale Earnhardt, the Intimidator, the man in black, the Milltown kid who became a king, the racer who lived for speed and gave everything he had, including everything he was, to the sport that raised him. He is still out there somewhere, racing into the distance, just ahead of memory and just beyond the reach of time. By the end of tonight, if you have listened to this story from its beginning, if you have followed the arc from the Milltown garage to the high banks of Daytona, from the first wrench to the last lap, From the poverty of a young man's early years to the pinnacle of American motorsport, you understand something that statistics and highlights and documentary footage cannot fully convey. You understand that the story of Dale Earnhardt is not a story about racing. It is a story about the things we build with our lives, the risks we take in their construction, and the legacies we leave behind when the construction is done, whether we are ready for it to end or not. The number 3, remember it. Not because it won 7 championships, although it did. Not because it struck fear into the hearts of every driver who saw it in their rearview mirror, although it did that too. Remember it because it belonged to a man who gave everything he had to the thing he loved, and because the sport he loved eventually learned, at the worst possible cost, to give something back.